Have you ever spoken a few angry words, only to realize they cost you the one person who never stopped loving you? Sometimes, a marriage doesn't fall apart because of betrayal, lies, or another person. Sometimes, it unravels in the quiet moments, when two hearts slowly stop hearing each other. Grant Sullivan never imagined that one exhausting evening would become the greatest regret of his life. Frustrated, emotionally drained, and carrying years of pain he had never learned to face, he looked at the woman who had stood faithfully beside him for 8 years, and said the words no wife should ever have to hear. "I can't stand you anymore." Autumn Hayes Sullivan didn't scream, she didn't argue, she didn't beg him to take the words back. She simply nodded, whispered two heartbreaking words, "I understand," and quietly walked away. By the next morning, she was gone. No dramatic goodbye, no revenge, no hateful messages, just an empty house, an untouched wedding photo, and something she left behind that would force Grant to confront the truth about the man he had become. But this isn't just a story about a broken marriage. It's a story about unresolved grief, emotional distance, forgiveness, and the painful journey of learning that love alone isn't enough. When communication disappears, it's a reminder that the people we cherish don't always leave because they stop loving us. Sometimes they leave because they've spent too long feeling unseen. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Have you ever said something in anger that you wished you could erase? Or have someone else's words stayed with you long after they were spoken? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story may remind someone that words carry more power than we realize. And if you're new to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, welcome to our family. Here, every story is more than entertainment. It's a journey through love, heartbreak, healing, and the life lessons that shape who we become. If you enjoy heartfelt stories with meaningful messages, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Your support helps this community continue to grow, and we'd love to have you with us. Now, take a deep breath, settle in, and let's travel to the charming streets of Charleston, South Carolina, where one ordinary evening, one sentence spoken in frustration, and one quiet goodbye would forever change two lives, and perhaps remind us all that the strongest relationships aren't built by perfect people, but by those willing to heal, forgive, and grow together. Charleston, South Carolina, had a way of making ordinary mornings look magical. The first rays of sunlight spilled across the historic streets, painting centuries-old brick buildings in shades of gold. The salty breeze drifted in from the harbor, carrying the distant cries of seagulls and the soft rhythm of boats rocking against wooden docks. It was the kind of city where tourists fell in love with life all over again. For Grant Sullivan and Autumn Hayes Sullivan, however, beauty had become something they noticed only in passing. From the outside, they looked like the kind of couple everyone admired. They lived in a charming two-story home, tucked inside one of Charleston's quiet neighborhoods. Their lawn was always trimmed. Fresh flowers bloomed beneath the front windows. Every Christmas, their house was the first on the street to sparkle with warm lights, and every summer they hosted neighborhood cookouts where laughter echoed long after sunset. People often smiled when they saw them together. What a perfect couple. They're lucky to have each other. I hope my marriage is like theirs someday. Grant would smile politely. Autumn would thank them warmly. Neither of them ever corrected the illusion. Because sometimes the hardest truths are the ones hidden behind the happiest photographs. That Tuesday morning began like hundreds before it. Autumn woke before sunrise, as she always did. She slipped quietly from beneath the blankets, careful not to disturb Grant. Standing beside the bed for a moment, she looked at him sleeping peacefully. Even after 8 years of marriage, there were mornings when she still found herself smiling at the sight of him. His dark blonde hair had become slightly unkempt overnight. One arm rested across the empty side of the bed where she had been sleeping only seconds earlier. His face looked younger while he slept, almost free from the invisible weight he carried every waking hour. She wished he smiled that way when he was awake. Closing the bedroom door softly behind her, Autumn padded downstairs and began her familiar routine. Coffee first, then breakfast. She sliced fresh strawberries into a bowl, toasted whole grain bread, scrambled eggs, and poured orange juice into 2 glasses. Nothing extravagant, just small acts of love. Acts no one applauded. Acts she never mentioned. Acts she believed helped keep a marriage alive. As the coffee brewed, she glanced toward the refrigerator. Dozens of photographs covered the silver door. Vacations in Savannah, family barbecues, beach sunsets, holiday dinners. There were pictures of nieces and nephews, friends, parents, even their golden retriever, Bailey, who had passed away 2 years earlier. There was only one thing missing: children. Her gaze lingered there a little longer than usual before she quietly looked away. Some absences are louder than words. At exactly 7 o'clock, Grant walked into the kitchen, wearing a navy blue dress shirt, already checking emails on his phone. "Morning," he said without looking up. "Good morning. I've got an early meeting. I figured I may be home late." She nodded. "I'll keep dinner warm." He reached for his coffee. "Thanks." Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, not angry, simply familiar. Years earlier, mornings had sounded different. They laughed while making pancakes, danced in the kitchen when old songs played on the radio, argued over who made better coffee, planned weekend road trips before finishing breakfast. Now, the television filled the quiet instead. Autumn watched Grant reading another email while absent-mindedly eating toast. She wondered if he had even noticed she'd made his favorite breakfast. He finished eating in less than 10 minutes. "I should get going." She smiled. "I hope your presentation goes well." He finally looked at her. "Thanks." For a brief second, she thought he might kiss her. Instead, he picked up his briefcase. "I'll text if I'm running late." The front door closed gently behind him. Autumn remained standing in the kitchen. The untouched second cup of coffee slowly cooled on the counter. She wrapped both hands around her mug and stared through the window as Grant's car disappeared down the street. "Have a good day," she whispered. No one heard her. Across town, Grant arrived at Sullivan and Pierce Architectural Group, where deadlines had become a way of life. The lobby buzzed with employees carrying blueprints, laptops, and coffee cups. Everyone greeted him warmly. "Morning, Grant. Big presentation today?" "You've got this." He answered every greeting with the same calm professionalism. Inside his office, however, he closed the door and leaned heavily against it. His chest felt tight. He rubbed his temples before dropping into his chair. Another sleepless night. Another day pretending everything was under control. The project his firm had spent nearly a year designing was entering its final phase, and millions of dollars depended on today's presentation. Pressure followed him everywhere. But work wasn't what exhausted him most. It was the silence waiting at home. He loved Autumn. At least, he believed he did. So why did coming home sometimes feel harder than staying late at the office? The thought unsettled him. He buried it beneath spreadsheets, construction schedules, and client meetings. Feelings could wait. Work couldn't. Across the city, Autumn parked outside the Children's Rehabilitation Center, where she worked as a pediatric occupational therapist. Within minutes, her entire demeanor changed. A little girl named Mia raced toward her, wearing bright pink braces on her legs. "Miss Autumn." Autumn laughed and knelt carefully. "Good morning, sunshine. I practiced tying my shoes." "You did?" Mia nodded enthusiastically. "And I only needed Mommy's help once." "That's amazing." Autumn held up her hand. "High five." Their palms met. The little girl beamed with pride. For the next several hours, Autumn encouraged children learning skills many people took for granted. Holding pencils, buttoning shirts, stacking blocks, walking confidently. Every tiny victory mattered. Parents often cried tears of joy after seeing progress that others considered ordinary. Autumn celebrated every milestone with them. She had endless patience, endless kindness, endless encouragement. Sometimes her co-workers joked that she had enough hope for an entire building. What none of them knew was that by the time she drove home every evening, she struggled to find even a little of that hope for herself. That afternoon, Grant's presentation ended with enthusiastic applause. The clients were thrilled. His partners congratulated him. Champagne was offered. Someone suggested celebrating over dinner. Grant smiled politely. "You all go ahead." "You sure?" "I've got a few things to finish." The truth was simpler. He couldn't explain why success no longer felt satisfying. No promotion, no award, no completed project seemed capable of filling whatever had quietly emptied inside him. He stared through his office window toward the Charleston skyline. His phone buzzed. A message from Autumn. "Hope your presentation went well. Proud of you. Drive safely." He read it, then placed the phone face down on his desk. He meant to reply. Instead, he opened another email. Hours passed. By the time he finally picked up his phone again, he realized he had never answered. He sighed. "I'll tell her when I get home." He had no idea that one postponed conversation would become another brick in the invisible wall growing between them. Outside, the afternoon sky slowly turned shades of orange and lavender as Charleston prepared for another peaceful evening. Inside two different hearts, however, a quiet storm had already begun to gather. Autumn pulled into the driveway just before 6 o'clock. The familiar little brick house looked exactly as it always had. Flower pots lined the front porch. Wind chimes swayed gently in the evening breeze, creating a melody that had once made her smile every time she came home. Tonight, the sound only reminded her how quiet everything else had become. She unlocked the front door and stepped inside. "Hello?" She called out instinctively. No answer. She already knew Grant wouldn't be home yet, but after years of marriage, old habits lingered. Setting her purse on the hallway table, she walked through the house, opening curtains to let the last rays of sunlight filter inside. The silence felt heavy. Not empty. Heavy. As if the walls themselves had witnessed every conversation that never happened. She changed into comfortable clothes and tied her curls into a loose bun before heading into the kitchen. Cooking had always been her favorite way to unwind. Her grandmother used to say, "Food is another language for love." Autumn had never forgotten those words. Tonight she decided to make Grant's favorite meal: grilled salmon, roasted asparagus, garlic mashed potatoes, and homemade peach cobbler for dessert. Not because it was a special occasion, because she missed the days when simple gestures still seemed to matter. As she seasoned the salmon, her phone buzzed. It was Danielle Brooks. "Hey, stranger," Danielle said the moment Autumn answered. "You disappeared after work." Autumn smiled faintly. "I just wanted to get home." "You sound tired." "I am." There was a brief silence before Danielle spoke again. "How are things, really?" Autumn leaned against the kitchen counter. "You mean with Grant?" "I do." Autumn stared out the window for several seconds. "I don't think we're fighting." "That doesn't sound very convincing." "We're not angry at each other, but—" She sighed. "It feels like we're roommates who happen to wear wedding rings." Danielle didn't interrupt. She knew Autumn well enough to let her finish. "I keep telling myself this season will pass, that work will slow down, that he'll eventually talk to me again the way he used to." "And has he?" Autumn's silence answered the question. Danielle spoke gently. "Have you told him how lonely you've been feeling?" "I've tried." "And?" "He always says he's just tired." "Do you believe him?" Autumn thought carefully before answering. "I believe he's tired." She paused. "I'm just not sure that's the whole story." Danielle's voice softened. "You know you can't fix a marriage by yourself." "I know. You also can't keep pretending you're okay if you're not." Autumn looked toward the family room. Framed wedding photos still decorated the shelves. In every picture, Grant looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. Sometimes she wondered where that version of him had gone. "I still love him," she whispered. "I know you do." "I don't want to lose us." Danielle answered with quiet honesty. "Then don't lose yourself trying to save us." The words lingered long after the call ended. Nearly an hour later, headlights swept across the living room window. Grant was home. Autumn quickly lowered the oven temperature to keep dinner warm and walked toward the front door. "Hi." Grant offered a tired smile. "Hey." She noticed the dark circles beneath his eyes. "You look exhausted." It was a long day. "How did the presentation go?" "We got the contract." Her face brightened. "Grant, that's wonderful." She stepped closer and wrapped her arms around him. For a second, he hugged her back. Then his phone vibrated inside his jacket pocket. The moment ended almost as quickly as it had begun. He glanced at the screen. "Sorry." "It's okay." He wasn't trying to hurt her. She knew that. But lately, everything seemed more important than the conversation standing right in front of him. Dinner was ready 10 minutes later. They sat across from each other at the dining table they had picked out together during their first year of marriage. Back then, they had spent nearly an entire Saturday arguing playfully over furniture styles before laughing so hard in the store that strangers had joined in. Now the same table felt much larger than it really was. Grant took a bite of salmon. "This is good." "I'm glad you like it." Another silence. Autumn reached for her water glass. "I talked to Danielle today." Grant nodded. "How's she doing?" "Busy." "That's good." Silence again. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the windows. Autumn watched the drops race down the glass. She remembered when rainy evenings meant board games, old movies and hot chocolate. When had they stopped making memories? She honestly couldn't remember. Grant's phone buzzed again. He glanced down. Autumn lowered her fork. "Can it wait until after dinner?" He hesitated. "It's the office." "They'll survive 20 minutes. I just need to answer this one email." She forced a smile. "Of course." He wasn't being cruel. He simply opened the email, typed a response. "Read another message." Typed again. 5 minutes passed. Autumn quietly finished eating. Not because she was hungry. Because waiting for his attention had become too painful. When Grant finally looked up, he noticed her untouched peach cobbler. "Aren't you having dessert?" "I've lost my appetite." He frowned. "Everything okay?" She almost laughed. Not because anything was funny, because it amazed her how easily people could miss what was happening right in front of them. "Grant." He looked at her. Really looked. For the first time all evening. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." She folded her hands together to stop them from trembling. When was the last time we had a conversation that wasn't about work, bills, groceries, or what time one of us would be home? Grant searched his memory. Nothing came. I don't know. I don't either. Rain continued falling outside. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Finally, Autumn said quietly, I miss my husband. The words landed with more weight than either of them expected. Grant looked down at his plate. I'm sitting right here. She shook her head gently. No. Her voice remained calm. You're physically here. She swallowed, but emotionally. She couldn't finish the sentence. Grant's shoulders stiffened. The exhaustion from work, the pressure of endless deadlines, and years of emotions he had never dealt with began pressing against him all at once. Without realizing it, he gripped his fork a little tighter. He wanted to explain. He wanted to tell her that he didn't even understand himself anymore. Instead, he said nothing. And sometimes, silence hurts just as deeply as the wrong words. Autumn took a slow breath. I don't need perfection, Grant. She met his eyes, hoping, just hoping, to find the man she had married. I just need to know we're still fighting for the same marriage. Grant opened his mouth to answer, but the words refused to come. The storm outside grew louder. Inside the dining room, another storm was only beginning. What do you think? Was Autumn right to finally speak up about how she was feeling, or should she have remained patient and waited for Grant to open up on his own? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below because every relationship is different, and your perspective could encourage someone who's going through a similar season. If this story has touched your heart so far, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. It helps us bring you more heartfelt stories filled with love, hope, second chances, and meaningful life lessons. Now, don't go anywhere, because in the next chapter, one conversation, one emotional outburst, and 5 heartbreaking words will change Grant and Autumn's lives forever. The rain continued long after dinner was over. Neither Grant nor Autumn had moved from the dining room. Half-empty glasses of water rested on the table between them, and the peach cobbler Autumn had baked with so much care remained untouched on the kitchen counter. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the Charleston sky. Inside, another storm was waiting to break. Grant finally pushed his chair back and stood. I think you're making this into something bigger than it is. Autumn looked up at him, surprised by how quickly he had dismissed everything she had just shared. I'm just under a lot of pressure right now. I know you are. You know this project has been consuming my life. I know. So why are we having this conversation tonight? Autumn's voice stayed calm. Because there will always be another project. Grant sighed heavily. That's not fair. I'm not trying to be fair. She stood as well, keeping several feet between them. I'm trying to save my marriage. The words lingered in the room. Grant rubbed the back of his neck. You're acting like we're falling apart. Aren't we? He looked away. Autumn noticed. That hurt more than if he had argued. For years, she had learned to read the spaces between his words. The silence, the avoidance, the way his eyes searched for an escape whenever conversations became emotional. She walked toward the kitchen window and watched raindrops race down the glass. Do you remember our first apartment? Grant managed a faint smile. The tiny one with the broken air conditioner? And the neighbors who argued every Saturday morning. He chuckled despite himself. They were loud. So were we. We argued about whose turn it was to wash dishes. And then we'd order pizza because neither of us wanted to cook. For a brief moment, the tension eased. The memory reminded them of a younger version of themselves. 2 people with very little money. But endless conversation, endless laughter, endless hope. Autumn turned back toward him. What happened to us, Grant? He didn't answer. Instead, he walked into the living room and loosened his tie. She followed. I'm not asking to blame you. Still no response. I'm asking because I genuinely don't know when we stopped feeling like partners. Grant closed his eyes. He was exhausted. Not just physically, emotionally. For years he had buried every uncomfortable feeling beneath work, deadlines and responsibility. Now those emotions were demanding to be heard all at once. It felt overwhelming. I don't know what you want me to say. I want the truth. The truth? Yes. She stepped closer. Are you unhappy? Grant hesitated. I've been stressed. That's not what I asked. Another silence. Grant. Please. No. Her voice cracked for the first time that evening. We've spent years saying please not tonight. Please after this deadline. Please when things calm down. But life never calms down. She wiped away a tear before it could fall. I've been waiting for my husband to come back. Grant stared at the floor. Every word she spoke felt like another weight pressing against his chest. Not because she was wrong. Because deep down, he knew she wasn't. He remembered the man he used to be. The man who surprised Autumn with flowers, simply because it was Tuesday. The man who couldn't wait to get home after work. The man who talked about dreams instead of deadlines. Somewhere along the way, he had disappeared. And he honestly didn't know how to find himself again. Autumn spoke gently. If you're hurting... She paused. You don't have to carry it alone. Grant's jaw tightened. You wouldn't understand. Then help me understand. You can't. Why not? Because you haven't lived inside my head. Autumn nodded slowly. You're right. She took another careful step. I haven't. But I've spent 8 years trying to knock on the door. Those words pierced him. He looked at her. Really looked. Her eyes were tired. Not from lack of sleep. From years of hoping. Years of trying. Years of loving someone who no longer knew how to let himself be loved. For one fleeting second, Grant almost broke. Almost told her everything. About waking in the middle of the night, haunted by memories of his younger brother. About feeling responsible for a death he still couldn't forgive himself for. About believing that if he kept everyone at arm's length, losing them wouldn't hurt as much. But old habits are difficult to break. Instead of opening his heart, he built another wall. I don't want to talk about this. Autumn lowered her head. You never do. Those 3 words echoed through the room. Grant felt cornered. Every emotion he had buried for years suddenly demanded space. His breathing became shallow. His patience disappeared. His frustration, never truly about Autumn, searched desperately for somewhere to land. Educational truths are often learned in moments like these. People rarely explode because of one conversation. They explode because of hundreds of conversations they refused to have. Grant didn't recognize that yet. He only knew he felt trapped. And trapped people sometimes hurt the ones trying hardest to help them. Autumn reached toward him, not to accuse him, not to stop him, simply to remind him that he wasn't alone. He instinctively stepped back. The movement lasted less than a second, but it shattered something inside her. She slowly withdrew her hand. The room fell silent once more. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Inside, both of them stood only a few feet apart. Yet they had never felt farther away. And neither of them realized that before the night was over, one sentence spoken in anger would change the course of both their lives forever. The silence stretched between them until it became almost unbearable. Grant walked toward the fireplace, resting one hand on the mantel as he stared at a framed photograph taken 6 years earlier. It had been their anniversary trip to the Blue Ridge Mountains. Autumn was laughing at something he had whispered just before the picture was taken. He remembered that day. He remembered thinking he was the luckiest man alive. How had they gone from that to this? Behind him, Autumn remained standing in the middle of the living room. She wasn't angry anymore. She was simply exhausted. Not the kind of exhaustion that sleep could fix. The kind that settles into a person's heart after carrying hope for too long without seeing it returned. Grant, she said softly, I'm not asking you to solve everything tonight. He didn't answer. I'm asking you to stop pretending everything is fine. It is fine. She let out a slow, painful breath. No, it isn't. He turned to face her. Why does every conversation have to become about what I'm doing wrong? She blinked. Is that what you've heard me say? Isn't it? I never said you were a bad husband. You didn't have to. I said, I miss you. You make it sound like I'm never here. You are here. She looked around the room before meeting his eyes again. You sleep in this house. You eat dinner here. You pay the bills. But being present isn't the same as being connected. Grant looked away. Those words hit harder than he wanted to admit. Autumn continued carefully. I've spent months trying to figure out what happened. I blamed your job. Then I blamed stress. Then I blamed myself. Her voice broke. I even wondered if maybe I just wasn't enough anymore. Grant's head snapped toward her. Don't say that. Why not? Because it's not true. Then tell me what's true. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Autumn gave a sad smile. That's what I thought. She walked to the bookshelf and picked up the small ceramic lighthouse they had bought during their honeymoon in Maine. You remember buying this? He nodded. You told me lighthouses weren't built to stop storms. She smiled faintly through tear-filled eyes. You said they were built to help people find their way through them. Grant remembered every word. Back then, hope had come naturally. Now even memories felt heavy. Autumn gently placed the lighthouse back on the shelf. I've been standing here with a light on for years, Grant. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. I'm just not sure you've been looking anymore. Those words settled deep inside him. Instead of responding with honesty, he responded with frustration. You think this is easy for me? I never said it was. You have no idea what it's like to carry everything I carry. And you have no idea what it's like to love someone who won't let you in. His breathing grew faster. Every sentence felt like another accusation. Every question felt like another reminder of how much he had failed. His mind raced. The deadlines, the sleepless nights, the guilt over his brother, the pressure to always appear strong, the constant fear that if he admitted he was falling apart, everything else would collapse too. He wasn't angry at Autumn. He was angry at himself. But pain has a dangerous habit of looking for the nearest target. Autumn stepped closer. Her eyes pleaded with him. I don't need you to be perfect. I don't need you to have all the answers. I just need to know you're still willing to fight for us. Grant closed his eyes. The room felt smaller. The walls felt closer. He couldn't breathe. He wanted the conversation to stop. He wanted the pressure to disappear. He wanted one moment of silence inside his own mind. Instead, Autumn asked the one question he wasn't emotionally prepared to answer. Do you even want this marriage anymore? Time seemed to freeze. Grant stared at her. His heart knew the answer. Of course he wanted his marriage. Of course he loved her. But his wounded mind interpreted the question as another demand, another expectation, another reminder that he wasn't enough. And then, without thinking, without weighing the consequences, without understanding that some words can never truly be taken back, he spoke. I can't stand you anymore. The room went completely still. Even the rain outside seemed quieter. Grant heard his own words the instant they left his mouth. His stomach dropped. He hadn't meant them. Not really. He had meant, I can't stand feeling like a failure. I can't stand carrying this grief. I can't stand the pressure. I can't stand the man I've become. But those weren't the words Autumn heard. She heard only one thing. I can't stand you anymore. Her face didn't twist with anger. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She didn't demand an explanation. The pain in her eyes was far worse than any argument could have been. She stood perfectly still, as if the air had been knocked from her lungs. Grant immediately took a step toward her. Autumn. Ah! She gently raised one hand. Not in anger. Just enough to stop him. For several long seconds, she searched his face. Not looking for an apology. Looking for hope. Looking for some sign that the man she loved was still there. Grant wanted to speak. To explain. To tell her he hadn't meant those words. But shame wrapped itself around his throat. He said nothing. Autumn lowered her eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost unbearably calm. I understand. Only 2 words. No accusations. No insults. No tears. Somehow, that hurt Grant even more. She quietly removed her wedding band from her finger. She looked at it for a long moment. Then, instead of placing it on the table, she slowly slipped it back onto her hand. Grant frowned, confused. She wasn't giving up on what the ring represented. She simply couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. Without another word, she turned and walked upstairs. Grant remained frozen where he stood. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind. Go after her. Apologize. Tell her the truth. Tell her you're scared. Tell her you still love her. But pride, fear, and years of emotional avoidance held him in place. He heard their bedroom door close upstairs. He told himself she just needed time. That tomorrow would be better. That they'd talk in the morning. He had no way of knowing that, by sunrise, the house would no longer feel like a home. And the quiet goodbye waiting for him would become the greatest regret of his life. Grant barely slept that night. He lay awake on his side of the bed, staring into the darkness while the steady rhythm of rain tapped against the bedroom windows. Every few minutes, he glanced toward Autumn's side of the bed. She wasn't there. When she had come upstairs earlier, she hadn't returned to their bedroom. Instead, she had quietly closed the guest room door. It was the first time in 8 years they had slept under the same roof, but in separate rooms. Grant told himself it was temporary. She just needs some space. Tomorrow we'll talk. Tomorrow, I'll apologize. Tomorrow I'll explain. Those promises repeated in his mind until exhaustion finally pulled him into a restless sleep. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the curtains much earlier than either of them would have liked. Grant woke to silence. Not unusual silence. Different silence. The kind that made a house feel unfamiliar. He reached for his phone. 6:47 a.m. Normally by this time, he would already smell fresh coffee drifting upstairs. He listened carefully. Nothing. No dishes clinking. No soft music playing from the kitchen. No footsteps moving through the hallway. He frowned. Maybe she left early for work. Still wearing yesterday's t-shirt, Grant walked downstairs. The kitchen was spotless. Too spotless. The coffee maker hadn't been turned on. The breakfast dishes weren't sitting in the sink. Autumn's favorite blue travel mug wasn't on the counter. Instead, there was a single white envelope resting beside the fruit bowl. His name was written across the front in Autumn's neat handwriting. Grant, his heartbeat quickened. He picked it up with trembling fingers. Inside was only one folded sheet of paper. It wasn't a goodbye letter. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't pages filled with anger. It was painfully simple. Grant, I'm giving you what you asked for, not because I stopped loving you, but because loving someone should never require convincing them to want your presence. I hope one day you find the peace you've been searching for. Please take care of yourself. Autumn. Grant read it once, then again, then a third time. His eyes fixed on one sentence. I'm giving you what you asked for. His stomach tightened. I didn't ask you to leave, he whispered. But deep down, he remembered exactly what he had said. I can't stand you anymore. The words echoed through his mind with unbearable clarity. He immediately grabbed his phone. Her name appeared at the top of his favorites list. He pressed call. It rang, then went to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. Instead, he sent a text. Can we talk? A minute passed. No reply. He typed another. I'm sorry about last night. Still nothing. He slipped the phone into his pocket and stood motionless in the middle of the kitchen. The house suddenly felt enormous. Across town, Autumn carefully placed the last cardboard box on the floor of a modest one-bedroom apartment. It wasn't much. A small living room, a compact kitchen, one bedroom overlooking a quiet courtyard filled with oak trees. The walls were plain. The furniture was borrowed. The rooms echoed when she walked. But for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt honest. Danielle set 2 paper cups of coffee on the kitchen counter. You don't have to unpack everything today. Autumn smiled weakly. I know. You can cry if you need to. I already did. When? Last night. Danielle walked over and wrapped her in a hug. Autumn leaned into her friend's embrace, finally allowing herself to breathe. I feel awful, she admitted. Because you left. Autumn nodded. I kept thinking maybe I should have stayed. Would staying have changed what happened? I don't know. Danielle gently pulled back. No. You hoped things would change for years. I know. You didn't leave because one sentence hurt you. Autumn looked down at the floor. You left because that sentence confirmed what you'd been feeling for a long time. Tears filled Autumn's eyes. I still love him. I know. I don't even want a divorce. Danielle nodded. Leaving isn't always about ending a marriage. She handed Autumn her coffee. Sometimes, it's the only way to stop losing yourself. Autumn stared out the apartment window. Children laughed somewhere in the courtyard below. A couple walked hand in hand toward the parking lot. Life continued, even when hearts were breaking. I hope he's okay, she whispered. Danielle looked at her with gentle disbelief. You're worried about him? Autumn smiled sadly. Loving someone doesn't disappear overnight. Grant couldn't focus at work. His computer screen blurred before his eyes. Emails piled up unanswered. During the morning meeting, one of the junior architects asked a question. Grant realized everyone was waiting for his response. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Could you repeat that? His co-workers exchanged concerned glances. This wasn't like him. At lunch, Luke Harrison found him sitting alone on a bench outside the office. You look terrible. I've had better mornings. Luke sat beside him. You and Autumn okay? Grant hesitated. No. What happened? Grant stared at the ground for several seconds. I said something I shouldn't have. Luke waited. What did you say? Grant swallowed hard. I told her. I couldn't stand her anymore. Luke's expression changed immediately. You didn't mean that? No. But I said it. And now? She left. Luke was silent for a long moment. Finally, he asked the question Grant had been avoiding since sunrise. Did she leave because of those words? Or because those words were the last straw? Grant didn't answer. Because somewhere deep inside, he already knew the truth. Sometimes, a relationship doesn't collapse because of one painful moment. It collapses because hundreds of painful moments were ignored, until one finally became impossible to survive. Grant lowered his head into his hands. For the first time, he began to wonder whether the biggest problem in his marriage had never been work. It had been all the conversations he was too afraid to have. Luke's question followed Grant for the rest of the afternoon. Did she leave because of those words? Or because those words were the last straw? No matter how hard he tried to push it away, the answer lingered in the back of his mind. By 5 o'clock, he had accomplished almost nothing. Blueprints lay untouched across his desk. Emails sat unanswered. The presentation that had seemed so important only 24 hours earlier suddenly felt meaningless. For the first time in years, Grant left the office before everyone else. The drive home was unusually quiet. Normally he listened to business podcasts or returned phone calls through the car's hands-free system. Today, he drove in silence. Every traffic light gave him another chance to replay the previous night. Every stop sign reminded him of Autumn's voice. "I miss my husband." He gripped the steering wheel tighter. "I was right there," he muttered. But the truth was impossible to ignore. He had been physically present. Emotionally, he had been miles away. When he pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly as it always had. The porch swing gently rocked in the afternoon breeze. The flower beds Autumn had planted were bursting with color. The white curtains in the front windows moved softly whenever the wind found its way inside. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. Grant unlocked the front door. "Autumn?" His voice echoed through the quiet house. There was no answer, only silence. For years, he had believed silence meant peace. Now he realized silence could also mean absence. He walked slowly from room to room. The living room still smelled faintly of Autumn's lavender candle. Her favorite throw blanket remained folded neatly across the couch. A novel she'd been reading rested on the coffee table, a bookmark still tucked between the pages. She hadn't left in anger. She had left carefully, respectfully, almost lovingly. That realization hurt more than he expected. Grant wandered upstairs. The guest room door stood open. The bed had been made. Only then did he notice the empty hangers in the closet. A few drawers stood open. Not everything was gone. Just enough. Enough clothes for a new beginning. Enough personal items to make it clear she hadn't left for the weekend. She had left because she believed she needed to. He leaned against the doorframe and closed his eyes. "I did this." The words barely escaped his lips. There was no one else to blame. Not work, not stress, not deadlines, not the weather. Him. Later that evening, hunger finally drove him downstairs. He opened the refrigerator. Inside sat several glass containers, each labeled in Autumn's neat handwriting. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. She had prepared meals for him. Even after the argument. Even after hearing the words that had shattered her heart. Grant rested one hand against the refrigerator door. His chest tightened. She had still been thinking about him. While he had been pushing her away, he removed one of the containers and stared at it for several seconds before placing it back. He wasn't hungry anymore. As he closed the refrigerator, something caught his attention. One of the kitchen drawers hadn't closed completely. Without thinking, he slid it open. Inside were neatly arranged pens, batteries, envelopes, and beneath them, a small stack of hardcover notebooks tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Grant frowned. He recognized them immediately. Autumn had written in those journals for years. Whenever life became overwhelming, she would disappear onto the back porch with one of them and a cup of coffee. He had always assumed they were private. He had never asked to read them. He had never been curious enough to wonder what she was writing. Tonight, he reached toward them, then stopped. This isn't right. He slowly closed the drawer. If Autumn had wanted him to read her journals, she would have shown them to him herself. He turned away, made it halfway across the kitchen, stopped again. His eyes drifted back toward the drawer. What if those pages held the answers to questions he had never thought to ask? He stood there for nearly a minute, wrestling with himself. Finally, he walked back. He untied the blue ribbon with trembling fingers. The first journal was dated nearly 6 years earlier. Inside the front cover, Autumn had written a simple sentence. "These pages are where I leave the words I can't seem to say out loud." Grant swallowed hard. He carefully turned the page. The first entry wasn't about disappointment or resentment. It was about him. Grant worked another 14-hour day today. He came home exhausted and apologized for missing dinner again. "I know he's trying so hard to provide for us. I just wish he knew that sometimes I'd rather have an hour of his attention than another promotion." Grant stared at the words. His throat tightened. He turned another page. "Today he smiled when I surprised him with lunch at work. That smile reminded me of the man I married. I hope life gives him more reasons to smile again." Another page. "Sometimes grief changes people so quietly that they don't realize they're disappearing. I don't think Grant stopped loving me. I think he stopped believing anyone could help carry what hurts inside him." Grant blinked rapidly. She knew. Not everything. But enough. Enough to see through the walls he had spent years building. His hands began to shake. He kept reading. Page after page. Year after year. There were no cruel accusations. No angry rants. No list of his failures. Instead, there were prayers. Hope. Compassion. questions she had never asked him because she didn't want to make his burden heavier. One passage stopped him completely. Today, I almost asked him if he still loved me. But then I saw how tired he looked when he walked through the front door. I couldn't bring myself to add one more weight to his shoulders. Maybe tomorrow will be easier. Grant covered his mouth. Tomorrow. How many tomorrows had she waited for? How many had he promised without saying the words? Outside, evening settled over Charleston. The last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the trees. Inside the quiet kitchen, Grant sat alone at the table, surrounded by journals that told the story of a marriage he thought he understood. For the first time in years, he wasn't seeing Autumn through the lens of his own exhaustion. He was seeing her through her own words. And with every page he turned, one painful truth became impossible to deny. The woman he believed he had lost overnight had actually been slipping away one lonely day at a time. Grant didn't realize he had fallen asleep at the kitchen table. Sometime after midnight, exhaustion finally overcame him. His head rested on folded arms while Autumn's journals lay open before him. The last words he remembered reading echoed through his mind long after sleep claimed him. I don't need Grant to become someone else. I just wish he'd let me love the parts of him that hurt. When his alarm sounded at 6:30 the next morning, he jolted awake. For a brief, hopeful second, he forgot everything. Then he saw the journals, the empty chair across from him, the cold coffee in his mug, and reality came rushing back. Autumn was gone. He showered, dressed for work, and stood in front of the bathroom mirror. The man looking back at him appeared older than he remembered. Dark circles framed his eyes. His shoulders slumped beneath the weight of sleepless nights. Even his neatly pressed shirt couldn't hide how exhausted he looked. You've been pretending for a long time, he quietly admitted to his reflection. It was the first honest thing he had said to himself in years. Across town, Autumn woke to sunlight filtering through the blinds of her small apartment. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then she noticed the unfamiliar ceiling, the quiet room, the stack of unopened boxes against the bedroom wall. She sat up slowly and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. The apartment felt strange. Not because it was uncomfortable, because it wasn't home, or at least, not yet. Her phone buzzed. It was her mother. Good morning, sweetheart. Morning, Mum. I've been thinking about you. I'm okay. There was a brief pause. You don't sound okay. Autumn smiled sadly. I'm learning that those are two different things. Her mother understood immediately. When your father and I went through our difficult years, someone gave me advice I'll never forget. What was it? They said, never make permanent decisions during temporary pain. Autumn listened quietly. But they also told me something else. What? Don't stay somewhere that slowly teaches you your heart doesn't matter. Tears gathered in Autumn's eyes. I didn't leave because I stopped loving him. I know. I left because I didn't recognize myself anymore. Her mother spoke gently. Sometimes love asks us to stay. And sometimes it asks us to step away long enough for the truth to become impossible to ignore. That afternoon, Grant found himself standing outside a quiet brick building with a simple sign near the entrance. Charleston Family Wellness Center. He had driven there, almost without thinking. Luke's words, Autumn's journals, the emptiness of the house. Everything had led him here. Still, he couldn't bring himself to walk inside. He remained in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel. What am I doing? He had never talked to a therapist. Growing up, emotions weren't discussed in the Sullivan household. When Grant's younger brother, Michael, died in a drunk driving accident 15 years earlier, the family grieved in silence. His mother rarely cried in front of anyone. His father returned to work only 4 days after the funeral. Whenever Grant tried to talk about Michael, someone would gently change the subject. Life goes on. Stay strong. Keep moving forward. Those became the unwritten rules of the family. So he did exactly that. He stayed busy, worked harder, ignored the nightmares, ignored the guilt, ignored the grief, until he became so good at ignoring his pain that he accidentally ignored everyone else's too, including Autumn's. He looked at the clinic again, then started the car. I'm not ready. He drove away. That evening, Luke stopped by the house carrying 2 takeout containers. I figured you hadn't eaten. Grant opened the door. You figured right. The 2 men sat on the back porch where Grant and Autumn used to spend Saturday mornings drinking coffee together. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Finally, Luke broke the silence. How's the house? Grant gave a humorless laugh. It's amazing how loud an empty house can be. Luke nodded. I know. As a widower, he understood loneliness better than most. Grant looked out toward the backyard. I found her journals. And? I thought they would be full of complaints. Were they? Grant slowly shook his head. They were full of love. Luke didn't seem surprised. That somehow makes it worse. It usually does. Grant looked at his friend. I don't understand how she kept loving me when I kept giving her so little. Luke thought carefully before answering. Because love and pain can exist in the same heart. Grant lowered his eyes. I don't deserve another chance. Luke leaned back in his chair. Maybe not today. Grant frowned. What does that mean? It means your first job isn't convincing Autumn to come home. Then what is? Luke looked directly at him. Becoming the kind of man she'd feel emotionally safe coming home to. The words settled heavily between them. Grant had expected advice about flowers, grand gestures, apologies. Instead, Luke had given him something much harder. Responsibility. The following Monday, Autumn walked into Dr. Rebecca Morgan's office. The room didn't feel clinical. Soft lighting warmed the space. Bookshelves lined one wall. 2 comfortable chairs faced each other near a large window overlooking a small garden. Dr. Morgan smiled warmly. Welcome, Autumn. Thank you. What brings you here today? Autumn hesitated, then answered with complete honesty. I think I've spent so much time trying to save someone else. I forgot how to take care of myself. Dr. Morgan nodded. That's a very brave place to begin. Autumn looked down at her hands. I still love my husband. I believe you. I don't want to stop loving him. You don't have to. Autumn looked up, surprised. Dr. Morgan smiled gently. Sometimes people think boundaries mean love has ended. They don't. Healthy boundaries simply protect love from becoming self-destruction. Autumn felt something shift inside her. No one had ever explained it that way before. For years she believed enduring loneliness proved how committed she was. Now she wondered, was love really meant to require losing yourself? The question stayed with her as she left the office. And for the first time since leaving home, she realized that healing wasn't about deciding whether her marriage would survive. It was about making sure that, whatever happened next, she would never abandon herself again. Grant didn't sleep much after Luke left. Long after the takeout containers had been thrown away and the porch lights had been switched off, he remained sitting in the darkness. The backyard was unusually still. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed through the Charleston night before fading into silence. He used to love quiet evenings like this. Now they felt unbearably loud. His eyes drifted toward the empty rocking chair beside him. That had always been Autumn's favorite seat. Every Saturday morning, she would sit there, wrapped in a blanket, a steaming mug of coffee warming her hands while she watched the sunrise. More than once, she had invited him to join her. More than once, he had answered the same way. Maybe next week. He suddenly realized how many next weeks had passed. Some opportunities don't disappear all at once. They disappear one postponed moment at a time. Grant lowered his head into his hands. I don't want another next week, he whispered. I want my wife. The following morning, he found himself parked outside Charleston Family Wellness Center once again. This time, he didn't turn the engine off immediately. He stared at the entrance for nearly 10 minutes. People came and went. A young couple walked inside, holding hands. An elderly man smiled politely as he left the building. A mother comforted her teenage son before they entered together. None of them looked ashamed. None of them looked weak. They looked human. Grant thought about something Autumn had written in one of her journals. Strong people aren't the ones who never break. They're the ones willing to admit when they're hurting. He closed his eyes. Then, for the first time in 15 years, he walked through the doors. The receptionist greeted him warmly. Good morning. How can I help you? Grant cleared his throat. I'd like to make an appointment. Of course. She smiled without asking unnecessary questions. Dr. Rebecca Morgan has an opening this morning if you're available. Grant almost said no. The familiar instinct to postpone rose inside him. But then he remembered another sentence from Autumn's journal. Tomorrow isn't promised. Neither is another chance. He nodded. I'll take it. Dr. Rebecca Morgan welcomed him into the same peaceful office where Autumn had sat only days earlier. Neither of them knew the other had already been there. Mr. Sullivan, she said kindly, please have a seat. Grant sat stiffly in the chair across from her. For nearly a minute, neither of them spoke. Finally, Dr. Morgan smiled. You don't have to know where to begin. Grant gave a nervous laugh. That's good. Why? Because I honestly don't. She nodded. Then let's start with something simple. She leaned forward slightly. What made you walk through my door today? Grant stared at the floor. My wife left. I'm sorry. So am I. What happened? He swallowed. I told her I couldn't stand her anymore. Doctor, Morgan remained calm. Did you mean those words? His answer came immediately. No. What did you mean? Grant frowned. I don't know. Take your time. The room fell quiet. He searched for an answer that had been buried beneath years of avoidance. Finally, he spoke. I can't stand feeling like I'm failing. I can't stand waking up every day pretending I'm okay. I can't stand carrying guilt that never goes away. His voice cracked. And I can't stand looking at the person I love most, knowing I don't know how to let her help me. Dr. Morgan nodded gently. Those are very different sentences. Grant closed his eyes. I know, but those aren't the ones I said. No, they weren't. For the next hour, Dr. Morgan asked questions Grant had spent years avoiding. Not about work, not about promotions, not about deadlines, about Michael, his younger brother. Grant hadn't spoken his brother's name out loud in years. Not because he had forgotten him, because remembering hurt too much. Tell me about him. Grant smiled faintly through tear-filled eyes. He was fearless. He climbed trees that were too high, jumped off docks before checking how deep the water was. He laughed louder than anyone else in the room. Grant looked toward the window. I used to spend half my childhood trying to keep him out of trouble. What happened the night he died? Grant's breathing slowed. He called me. Dr. Morgan waited. I was working late. He asked if I wanted to meet some friends. I told him I was too busy. Grant rubbed his eyes. An hour later, his voice broke. A drunk driver crossed the center line. Silence filled the room. Grant wiped away tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in 15 years. I always thought. He struggled to finish. I always thought if I had gone with him, maybe things would have been different. Dr. Morgan spoke carefully. So you've spent 15 years carrying responsibility for someone else's crime. Grant looked confused. I should have been there. You loved your brother. I did. But loving someone doesn't give us control over everything that happens to them. Grant stared at her. She continued gently. Guilt often convinces us that if we blame ourselves, we'll somehow make tragedy easier to understand. He had never heard grief explained that way before. It shook something loose inside him. Across town, Autumn spent her Saturday morning volunteering at a neighborhood community garden. Children laughed as they planted tomatoes and herbs. Older neighbors shared gardening tips while passing around lemonade. For the first time in weeks, Autumn found herself smiling without forcing it. A little boy struggled to dig a hole for a sunflower. She knelt beside him. Can I show you a trick? He nodded eagerly. Together, they loosened the soil. The flower settled gently into the ground. When will it bloom? The boy asked. Autumn smiled. Not today. Tomorrow? Probably not. He frowned. Then when? She looked at the tiny plant. It takes time. You water it. You protect it. You keep showing up, even when you don't see results. One day, well, she smiled. You'll realize it was growing the whole time. The boy grinned. I can do that. As he ran back to his parents, Autumn remained kneeling beside the flower. Her smile slowly faded into quiet reflection. Healing wasn't very different. You couldn't rush it. You couldn't force it. You simply kept showing up. One honest day at a time. That evening, Grant returned home carrying something he hadn't felt in years. Not happiness, not relief, hope. Small, fragile, almost unfamiliar. He walked into the kitchen and looked toward the drawer where Autumn's journals were tied together with a faded blue ribbon. He didn't open them immediately. Instead, he stood quietly and made a promise to himself. I won't ask her to come home until I've become someone worth coming home to. It wasn't a promise to win Autumn back. It was a promise to become the man he had stopped being, long before she packed her bags. Outside, the sun dipped below the Charleston skyline, painting the sky with shades of gold and crimson. Two people, living under different roofs, ended the same day with the same quiet realization. Healing couldn't begin by changing each other. It had to begin by facing the parts of themselves they had been running from for far too long. Neither of them knew what the future would hold. But for the first time, they were both walking toward it instead of away from it. Nearly 3 months passed. Charleston welcomed spring with blooming magnolia trees, longer afternoons, and streets alive with visitors exploring the historic district. Life moved forward. It always did. The question was whether the people living it chose to move forward with it. For Grant Sullivan, every day had become an opportunity to make one small decision differently than he had the day before. Not because he expected Autumn to notice, Because Dr. Rebecca Morgan had challenged him with a question he couldn't stop thinking about. If Autumn never came back, would you still become the man you're working to become? At first, the question had frustrated him. Of course, he wanted her back. Every counseling session, every difficult conversation, every painful memory he unpacked seemed tied to the hope that one day she might walk through their front door again. But as the weeks passed, something inside him slowly shifted. He realized he couldn't build lasting change on the possibility of someone else's decision. Real change had to come from conviction, not desperation. That lesson wasn't easy. Some mornings, he still reached for his phone, wanting to call Autumn before remembering he had promised to give her the space she had asked for. Instead of texting her, he wrote his thoughts in a notebook Dr. Morgan had encouraged him to keep. The first pages were awkward. He wasn't used to writing about emotions. He wrote about meetings, traffic, the weather, anything except what mattered. Then, one afternoon, after a particularly emotional therapy session, he finally wrote the sentence he had avoided for years. I don't know how to forgive myself for surviving when Michael didn't. He stared at those words for nearly 5 minutes. Then, for the first time since his brother's funeral, he cried without trying to stop himself. Not because someone had forced him to, because he finally understood that grief ignored doesn't disappear. It simply changes shape. Sometimes it becomes anger. Sometimes it becomes silence. Sometimes it becomes distance from the people who love us most. Dr. Morgan had been right. You couldn't heal a wound by pretending it no longer existed. Autumn's life had changed just as dramatically. Her apartment no longer looked temporary. Family photographs decorated the walls. Fresh herbs grew in small pots along the kitchen window. A bookshelf Danielle had insisted she buy now held novels, journals, and several books on emotional wellness that Dr. Morgan had recommended. The apartment was still modest, but it had begun to feel like a peaceful place instead of a hiding place. Every Saturday morning, Autumn walked to a nearby farmer's market. The vendors had started recognizing her. "Good morning, Miss Autumn," called Mr. Alvarez, who sold fresh flowers. "I've got sunflowers today." She smiled. "They're beautiful. They remind me of you." Autumn laughed softly. "How's that?" "They always turn toward the light." The simple observation stayed with her long after she left his stand. For months, she had focused on everything she had lost. Now she was beginning to notice what she was finding. Confidence, peace, time to breathe, time to think, time to remember who she had been before every conversation revolved around trying to save a marriage. That didn't mean she loved Grant any less. It meant she was finally learning that loving herself didn't take anything away from loving someone else. One Friday afternoon, Danielle stopped by the rehabilitation center to take Autumn to lunch. "You've been smiling more lately," Danielle observed as they waited for their meals. "Have the first?" "You have." Autumn stirred her iced tea thoughtfully. "I don't think I'm happier." "No? I think I'm lighter." Danielle nodded. "There's a difference." Autumn smiled. "I still miss him." "I know. I pray for him every day." Danielle reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. "And what do you pray for?" Autumn didn't answer immediately. Finally she said, "Not that he comes back to me." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "I pray that he finds peace." The answer brought tears to Danielle's eyes. "That's one of the kindest things I've ever heard." Autumn looked out the restaurant window. "I don't want the old Grant back." "No?" She slowly shook her head. "The old Grant wasn't happy. He was just good at pretending." She smiled sadly. "If we ever find our way back to each other." She paused. "I want it to be because we're both healthier than we were before." That same evening, Grant stood in front of his closet holding one of Autumn's sweaters. It had somehow been left behind. He had noticed it weeks earlier, but couldn't bring himself to move it. Tonight, instead of putting it back, he folded it carefully and placed it inside a storage box with several other things that belonged to her. Not because he wanted to erase her, because he was beginning to understand the difference between holding on to memories and refusing to move forward. Healing wasn't forgetting. Healing was learning how to carry the past without letting it control the present. As he sealed the box, the doorbell rang. Luke stood outside carrying 2 bicycles. Grant looked at him, confused. "Bicycles?" Luke grinned. "You've spent 3 months going from work to therapy, and from therapy back home." So today we're doing something different." Grant folded his arms. "I haven't ridden a bike in years." "Exactly." Luke handed him a helmet. "You've also forgotten how to enjoy yourself." An hour later, the 2 friends were riding along the paved trails beside Charleston Harbor. The breeze carried the scent of salt water. Children laughed as they flew kites in a nearby park. Couples walked hand in hand along the waterfront. Grant noticed something unusual. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about work. He wasn't replaying the argument. He wasn't imagining every possible future. He was simply present. Luke slowed beside him. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Grant smiled. "It does." Luke looked ahead. "Don't mistake moments like this for moving on." Grant frowned. "I'm not. They're something better." "What?" "They're reminders that healing doesn't mean life stops being beautiful." Grant looked across the harbor, where the evening sun reflected off the water in shimmering shades of gold. He realized how long it had been since he had truly noticed a sunset. Not because they had disappeared, because he had stopped looking. As they continued riding, he silently promised himself something else. If he was ever given another chance with autumn, he would never again become so consumed by tomorrow that he failed to appreciate the moments happening today. Because those ordinary moments, morning coffee, shared dinners, quiet walks, simple conversations, were never ordinary at all. They were the very moments that built a lifetime together, and he had finally begun to understand their worth. The following Tuesday, Grant arrived at Dr. Rebecca Morgan's office carrying the small notebook she had encouraged him to keep. He had filled nearly half its pages, not with perfect reflections, not with profound insights, just honesty. For a man who had spent years hiding behind silence, honesty was progress. Dr. Morgan smiled as he settled into the chair across from her. "You look different today." Grant gave a small laugh. "I've heard that twice this week. What do you think people are noticing?" He thought for a moment. "I think I'm finally slowing down." She nodded. "What happens when you slow down?" "I notice things." "Such as?" He leaned back, searching for the right words. "I notice how often I interrupted Autumn before she could finish a sentence." He paused. "I notice how many dinners I spent looking at my phone instead of looking at her." Another pause. "I notice that she wasn't asking me to fix her problems." His voice grew quieter. "She was asking me to let her into mine." Dr. Morgan smiled gently. "That's an important realization." Grant lowered his eyes. "It came too late." "Maybe." She folded her hands. "But growth isn't measured by how quickly it happens. It's measured by whether it's genuine." Grant looked thoughtful. "For years I believed love meant providing." "It does. But that's only one way." She continued. "Providing financially matters. Providing stability matters. But emotional presence is also a form of provision." Grant repeated the phrase softly. Emotional presence. He realized he had spent years building beautiful homes for other families, while unknowingly allowing his own home to grow emotionally empty. The irony wasn't lost on him. Meanwhile, Autumn had accepted Danielle's invitation to attend a Saturday women's wellness workshop hosted at the Charleston Community Center. Months earlier, she would have politely declined. Now, she was learning to say yes to opportunities that helped her grow. The room was filled with women from every stage of life. Some were newly married, some divorced, some widowed. Others simply wanted healthier relationships. The speaker, an older counselor named Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, stood at the front of the room. "I'd like everyone to answer one question," she said warmly. "What does healthy love feel like?" Several hands went up. "Safe, respectful, peaceful, honest." Mrs. Brooks smiled. Beautiful answers. Then she asked another question. "What does unhealthy love often feel like?" This time, the room grew quiet. Finally, one woman whispered, "Lonely." Another added, "Like I'm never enough." A third said, "Like I'm constantly trying to earn something that should already exist." Autumn felt her chest tighten. She wasn't alone. For so long she had believed her experience was unique. Now she realized many people quietly carried similar burdens. Mrs. Brooks continued, "Healthy love isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of emotional safety." Those words settled deeply within Autumn. She thought back to the countless evenings she had rehearsed conversations in her head before Grant came home. Not because she feared he would yell, because she feared he would emotionally disappear. There is a special kind of loneliness that comes from feeling unseen by the person you love most. She understood that now more clearly than ever. After the workshop ended, the participants gathered outside beneath large oak trees draped with Spanish moss. A young woman approached Autumn. "My name's Rachel." "I'm Autumn." Rachel smiled. "I really appreciated what you shared during the discussion." Autumn laughed softly. "I wasn't sure anyone noticed." "I did." Rachel hesitated before speaking again. "You said something that stayed with me." "What was that?" "You said that loving someone shouldn't require abandoning yourself." Autumn looked down thoughtfully. "I wish I'd understood that years ago." Rachel smiled. "Maybe you learned it so you could help someone else understand it sooner." As Rachel walked away, Autumn stood quietly beneath the shade of the trees. Sometimes, life's hardest lessons become someone else's greatest encouragement. Perhaps pain didn't always have to end in bitterness. Perhaps it could become wisdom instead. That evening, Grant stopped at the neighborhood grocery store on his way home. As he reached for a loaf of bread, he heard a familiar voice. "Grant?" He turned. Standing at the end of the aisle was Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins, the elderly widow who had lived next door for nearly 6 years. She smiled warmly. "It's good to see you." "You too, Mrs. Jenkins." She looked around. "No Autumn tonight?" Grant's smile faded slightly. "No." Mrs. Jenkins noticed immediately. "I'm sorry." He nodded. "We're taking some time apart." The older woman reached out and gently touched his arm. "You know, my late husband and I were married for 53 years. Grant smiled politely. "That's incredible." "It wasn't always easy." She chuckled. "There were seasons when we barely understood each other." "What made it last?" Mrs. Jenkins answered without hesitation. "We never stopped being curious about each other." Grant frowned. "What do you mean?" She placed a carton of milk into her shopping cart. "People change. The mistake many couples make is assuming they already know everything about the person they married." She smiled knowingly. "So they stop asking questions. They stop listening. They stop discovering who their spouse is becoming." Grant felt those words settle heavily in his heart. When was the last time he had asked Autumn how she was doing, and truly listened to the answer? He couldn't remember. Mrs. Jenkins smiled gently before continuing down the aisle. As Grant watched her walk away, he realized something profound. For years, he had expected Autumn to understand every change happening inside him. Yet he had stopped paying attention to the changes happening inside her. Love wasn't simply about being known. That night, Grant returned home and opened the notebook Dr. Morgan had given him. Instead of writing about his own progress, he made a different list. At the top of the page, he wrote, "Things I want to ask Autumn someday," he began writing. "What dream have you been carrying that I never noticed? What made you feel most loved during our marriage? When did you first begin feeling alone? If we ever get another chance, what would emotional safety look like for you?" He stared at the questions for a long time. Then he quietly closed the notebook. For the first time, his goal wasn't preparing the perfect apology. It wasn't convincing Autumn to forgive him. It was becoming someone capable of understanding her in ways he never had before. Outside, another Charleston sunset painted the sky in soft shades of amber and rose. Miles away, Autumn stood on the balcony of her apartment watching the very same sunset. Neither of them knew that life was quietly preparing their paths to cross again. But when that moment finally came, they would not be the same two people who had said goodbye 3 months earlier. What do you think about Grant and Autumn's journey so far? Do you believe people can truly change when they're willing to face their deepest wounds? Or do you think some relationships are simply too broken to be repaired? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective could encourage someone who may be walking through a difficult season in their own relationship. If this chapter reminded you that healing begins with honesty and personal growth, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, and turn on notifications so you never miss another heartfelt story filled with love, hope, second chances and meaningful life lessons. And don't miss the next chapter, because after months apart, fate is about to place Grant and Autumn in the same place for the very first time. Will they walk past each other as strangers, or will one unexpected moment change everything? Join us in Chapter 6 to find out. 4 months had passed since Autumn walked out of the home she and Grant had once filled with dreams. By now, Charleston had settled comfortably into early summer. Tourists crowded the waterfront. Horse-drawn carriages rolled through the historic district. Street musicians filled the air with jazz and country melodies, while families wandered between local cafes and small bookstores. Life had continued moving forward. And, little by little, so had Grant and Autumn. Not together, separately. Saturday mornings had become Grant's favorite time of the week, not because he had nowhere to be, but because, for the first time in years, he had stopped believing every free hour needed to be filled with work. Instead, he developed a new routine. Coffee, a long walk along the Battery, his journal, then breakfast at a small cafe overlooking the harbor. The owner, Mrs. Linda Foster, now recognized him. "The usual?" she asked with a smile. Grant nodded. "Please." As she poured his coffee, she noticed the notebook resting beside him. "Writing a book?" Grant chuckled. "Not exactly." "So, what's in there?" He smiled thoughtfully. "A lot of things I should have said years ago." Mrs. Foster placed the mug in front of him. "Better late than never." Grant looked down at the notebook. Maybe, but he had also learned that late still came with consequences. Across town, Autumn had created new traditions of her own. She no longer spent every Saturday wondering whether Grant would make time for breakfast together. Instead, she volunteered twice a month at a literacy program for elementary school children. She loved watching their confidence grow with every page they read. That morning, 8-year-old Caleb struggled through a chapter from his favorite adventure novel. Halfway through, he sighed dramatically. "This is hard." Autumn smiled. "It is. I don't think I'm getting better." She closed the book gently. "Can I ask you something?" He nodded. "When you planted that sunflower at the community garden a few months ago." His face brightened. "I remember." "Did it bloom the next day?" He laughed. "No." "The next week?" "No." "So why didn't you dig it up?" He thought for a moment. "Because it was still growing." Autumn smiled warmly. "Exactly." Caleb looked at the book in front of him. "So reading is like that? So is healing. So is trust. So is becoming stronger." The little boy grinned. "Then I guess I should keep practicing." Autumn's smile lingered long after he returned to reading. Sometimes, the lessons we teach others quietly remind us of what we still need to believe ourselves. That afternoon, Grant received a call from Luke. "You busy?" "Not really." "Good. Our fire station is hosting a neighborhood family day." Grant frowned. "You want me to come to a fire station?" "I want you to come outside." Grant laughed. "I'll be there." The station buzzed with activity. Children climbed into fire trucks. Families enjoyed barbecue and live music. Local businesses had set up booths throughout the park. Grant hadn't expected such a large crowd. Luke handed him a bottled water. "Relax." "I am relaxed." Luke laughed. "No, you're pretending to be relaxed." Grant shook his head. "Therapy has made you way too observant." "No." Luke smiled. "It's made you easier to read." Grant looked around. Parents laughed while chasing toddlers across the grass. Teenagers competed in relay races. An older couple danced slowly to a country song playing through outdoor speakers. Ordinary moments. The kind he had overlooked for years. Luke followed his gaze. "You know what all these people have in common?" Grant shrugged. "They're present." Luke nodded. "Exactly. They're not worrying about Monday. They're not replaying yesterday. They're here." Grant quietly absorbed those words. For so much of his life, he had lived everywhere except the present. When he was at work, he worried about home. When he was home, he thought about work. When he was with Autumn, his mind was somewhere else entirely. He understood now why she had felt alone. His body had been beside her. His attention rarely had. Across the park, Autumn arrived with Danielle, who had volunteered to help organize the literacy booth. Neither woman knew Grant was there. "You ready?" Danielle asked. Autumn smiled. "As ready as I'll ever be." Together, they carried boxes of children's books toward their assigned tent. As Autumn arranged colorful storybooks across a table, she noticed dozens of smiling families walking through the park. A familiar ache touched her heart. She had once imagined bringing her own children to events like this. For a moment, sadness threatened to pull her backward. Then she remembered something Dr. Rebecca Morgan had told her only days earlier. "You can grieve the life you hoped for without refusing the life you're still living." Autumn took a slow breath. She smiled at the next child who approached the table. "Would you like to pick out a book?" The little girl nodded excitedly. Autumn knelt beside her. "What kinds of stories do you like?" "Happy ones." Autumn smiled. "Those are my favorite too." Neither Grant nor Autumn realized that, at that very moment, they were less than 100 yards apart, separated only by a row of food trucks, and a timing that neither of them could control. Sometimes life doesn't reunite people with dramatic coincidences. Sometimes it waits until both hearts have grown enough to recognize each other again. Neither of them was ready, not quite, but fate was quietly closing the distance. The afternoon sun hung high above Charleston as more families poured into the community event. Laughter drifted through the park. Children lined up for face painting. The aroma of grilled barbecue mixed with the sweetness of kettle corn. It was the kind of day that reminded people to slow down and enjoy life. Grant stood beside Luke, watching a group of young firefighters demonstrate rescue equipment for curious children. "You've been awfully quiet," Luke observed. Grant smiled faintly. "I've been thinking." "Dangerous habit." Grant laughed. "You know what Dr. Morgan asked me this week?" Luke raised an eyebrow. "What?" "She asked me when I stopped becoming curious about my own wife." Luke didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up 2 bottled waters from a nearby cooler and handed one to Grant. "That's a good question. I thought I knew everything about Autumn." "And did you?" Grant slowly shook his head. "I knew who she was." He looked across the park. "I stopped paying attention to who she was becoming." Luke nodded thoughtfully. People aren't photographs. They're always changing. If we're not paying attention, we end up loving a memory instead of the person standing in front of us. Grant stared at him. I wish someone had told me that years ago. Luke smiled. They probably did. You just weren't ready to hear it. Grant couldn't argue with that. Only a short distance away, Autumn was helping a little girl choose her first chapter book. This one has dragons, the girl said excitedly. It does. And this one has horses. It does. The little girl frowned dramatically. I can't decide. Autumn smiled. Sometimes the hardest choices aren't between something good and something bad. They're between two good things. The girl's mother laughed. I think that's true for adults too. Autumn nodded. It definitely is. As the family walked away, Danielle stepped beside her. You have a gift. For what? For making people feel seen. Autumn looked down as she straightened another stack of books. I didn't always feel that way. Danielle rested a hand on her shoulder. I know. There was a brief silence before Danielle asked carefully, Can I ask you something? Of course. If Grant walked up to you today. Autumn didn't let her finish. I don't know. You don't? I know I'd be kind. She paused. But kindness isn't the same as readiness. Danielle smiled proudly. That's growth. Months ago, Autumn would have confused forgiveness with pretending nothing had happened. Now she understood that forgiveness and trust were not the same thing. Forgiveness could begin in a moment. Trust had to be rebuilt over time. Meanwhile, Grant wandered toward one of the quieter walking paths at the edge of the park. He needed a few minutes away from the crowd. As he passed the community garden, something caught his eye. Bright yellow sunflowers stretched toward the afternoon sun. Grant stopped walking. One flower, in particular, stood taller than the rest. Its petals glowed brilliantly against the summer sky. A small wooden sign stood nearby. Community Garden Project. Planted by local families and volunteers. Grant smiled. Autumn would have loved this. Without realizing it, he took out his phone. His finger hovered over her contact. He wanted to send a picture. She would probably smile. Then he remembered the promise he had made. He wouldn't interrupt her healing simply because he missed her. Slowly, he slipped the phone back into his pocket. Sometimes love means resisting the urge to satisfy your own loneliness. It means respecting someone else's need for peace. Grant looked at the sunflower one last time before continuing down the path. At almost that exact moment, Autumn left the literacy booth carrying a box of donated books toward the event's storage tent. The box was heavier than she expected. She adjusted her grip. Just as she rounded a corner, a teenage volunteer accidentally bumped into her shoulder. Oh! The box slipped from her hands. Books scattered across the sidewalk. I'm so sorry, the teenager exclaimed. It's okay. Autumn knelt immediately. So sorry. Accidents happen. As she gathered the books, another pair of hands reached down to help. Here you go. She smiled automatically without looking up. Thank you. The man handed her another book. Their fingers almost touched. Something about his voice felt strangely familiar. Autumn looked up. Across the box of scattered books, her eyes met Grant's. Everything around them seemed to disappear. The music, the laughter, the conversations, even the warm summer breeze. Neither of them spoke. Grant's heart pounded so hard he wondered if she could hear it. Autumn's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't how she had imagined seeing him again. If she had imagined it at all. Months of healing, months of unanswered questions. Months of separate lives, suddenly stood face to face beneath the shade of a large oak tree. Grant was the first to find his voice. Hi, Autumn. She swallowed gently. Hi, Grant. Silence settled between them. Not the painful silence they once shared across their dinner table. This silence felt different, careful, respectful, almost uncertain. Grant noticed she looked healthier. There was still sadness in her eyes, but there was also peace. A quiet confidence he hadn't seen in a long time. Autumn noticed changes too. His shoulders no longer carried the same constant tension. His expression seemed softer, more open. For the first time in years, his eyes were fully present. Grant bent down and picked up the final book from the ground. He brushed a little dirt from its cover before handing it to her. I'm sorry about that. She accepted it with a gentle smile. It wasn't your fault. He knew she wasn't talking about the books. Their eyes met again. 1,000 words remained unspoken. Grant wanted to apologize, to explain everything, to tell her about therapy, about Michael, about the journals, about how deeply sorry he was. Instead, he remembered something Dr. Morgan had told him. Don't rush to ease your guilt. Be patient enough to earn someone's trust. So he simply asked, "How have you been?" Autumn looked at him for a long moment, before answering honestly, "I'm doing better." Grant smiled. "I'm really glad to hear that." "And you?" He nodded slowly. "I'm learning." It wasn't a dramatic reunion. There were no tears, no embrace, no promises. Just two people standing in the same place. Both noticeably different from the day they had said goodbye. Across the park, Danielle noticed them from a distance. Luke noticed too. Neither interrupted. Some conversations are too important to rescue. They simply require space. Autumn adjusted the books in her arms. "I should get these to the storage tent." Grant nodded. "Of course." She took a few steps away, then paused. Turning back, she offered a small but genuine smile. "It was good to see you, Grant." His eyes softened. "It was good to see you too." She walked away without looking back. Grant remained beneath the oak tree, watching her disappear into the crowd. Oddly enough, his heart didn't break all over again. Instead, it filled with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months. Not certainty, not expectation, hope. Because for the first time since she left, their conversation hadn't ended with pain. It had ended with kindness. And sometimes, kindness is the first fragile bridge back to trust. Grant stood beneath the old oak tree long after Autumn disappeared into the crowd. He wasn't replaying what he should have said. For once, he was grateful for what he hadn't. Months earlier, he would have chased after her. He would have apologized repeatedly, hoping enough words could erase the damage caused by one careless sentence. Now he understood something different. Healing couldn't be rushed simply because he was ready. Autumn deserved the freedom to decide when, or if, she wanted him back in her life. Luke eventually walked over, slipping his hands into the pockets of his jeans. "So," he said with a knowing smile. "How'd it go?" Grant looked toward the literacy tent where Autumn was laughing with a little girl, choosing a book. "It was peaceful." Luke raised an eyebrow. "Peaceful?" "We talked." "And?" "I asked how she was." "What did she say?" "She said she was doing better." Luke nodded. "And how did that make you feel?" Grant thought for a moment. "A little sad." "Why?" "Because I realized she had to leave me to find that peace." Luke rested a hand on his friend's shoulder. "Sometimes people don't walk away because they stop loving us. They walk away because staying keeps hurting." Grant lowered his head. "I know, but seeing her today..." He smiled faintly. "She looked lighter. That's a good thing." "I know. I just wish she hadn't needed to leave to feel that way." Luke looked directly at him. "Then learn from it." Grant frowned. "If life gives you another chance, don't make her choose between loving you and protecting herself." Those words stayed with Grant for the rest of the afternoon. Across the park, Danielle helped Autumn pack the remaining books into storage boxes. "You okay?" she asked, gently. Autumn smiled. "I think so. I saw you talking." "So did half the park." Danielle laughed. "No tears?" "No." "No argument?" "No." "No dramatic declarations of love?" Autumn shook her head, smiling. "It wasn't like that." "What was it like?" Autumn paused as she folded an empty cardboard box. It felt... No, she searched for the right word. "Safe." Danielle looked surprised. "Safe?" He listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to defend himself. He didn't ask me to come home. She looked across the park where Grant and Luke were loading chairs into a pickup truck. He just listened. Danielle smiled knowingly. "That sounds different." "It is." Autumn took a slow breath. "For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel responsible for managing his emotions." Those words surprised even her. She hadn't realized how exhausting that responsibility had become, until it was gone. The following Wednesday, Grant arrived for another therapy session. Dr. Rebecca Morgan noticed the subtle smile on his face. "You've had an interesting week." Grant laughed softly. "Is it that obvious?" She smiled. "What happened?" "I saw Autumn." Dr. Morgan waited. "Tell me about it." He described the chance meeting, the scattered books, the awkward greeting, the brief conversation. When he finished, Dr. Morgan leaned back thoughtfully. "What are you most proud of?" Grant frowned. "I don't know." "You didn't apologize." "I wanted to." "I know. So why didn't you?" He answered without hesitation. "Because I realize the apology I owe her isn't measured by words anymore." Dr. Morgan smiled warmly. "What is it measured by?" "My actions. My consistency. The man I become." She nodded. "That's an important shift." Grant looked thoughtful. I used to think saying, "I'm sorry" was enough. Sometimes it is. And sometimes people have heard "I'm sorry" many times. She folded her hands. What they need to see is, "I've changed." Grant slowly nodded. That sentence settled deep inside him. That same evening, Autumn attended her weekly counseling session. Dr. Morgan welcomed her with the same calm smile. "You seem different today." Autumn laughed. "Everyone keeps saying that." "How do you feel?" She thought carefully before answering. "I feel peaceful." "What changed?" "I saw Grant." Dr. Morgan didn't seem surprised. "And?" "It wasn't painful." Autumn paused. "It was emotional. But not painful." She smiled faintly. "He looked healthier. He looked present." She hesitated before adding, "I've never seen him look at me the way he did that day." "How did he look at you?" "As if he was truly listening." "Doctor," Morgan nodded. "And how did that make you feel?" Autumn looked toward the window. "Hopeful," she quickly added. "But hope isn't the same as trust." "No, it isn't." Dr. Morgan smiled gently. "What would rebuilding trust require?" Autumn answered almost immediately. "Consistency." "What else?" "Honesty." She thought for another moment. "And time." Dr. Morgan nodded approvingly. "Those are wise answers." Autumn smiled. "I've learned that people can change." She paused. "But real change shouldn't have to be announced. It should simply become visible." Several days later, Grant's phone buzzed while he was reviewing blueprints in his office. The screen displayed a name he hadn't expected to see. Autumn Hayes Sullivan. His heart skipped. He stared at the phone for several seconds before answering. "Hello?" "Hi, Grant." Her voice was calm. "Hi. I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all." There was a brief silence. Then Autumn spoke. "I found something while unpacking another box." Grant frowned. "What was it?" "One of your sketchbooks." He smiled. "I've been wondering where that disappeared to." "I thought you might want it back." "I would." Another quiet pause. "We could meet somewhere public," Autumn suggested. "Just long enough for me to give it to you." Grant smiled to himself. "I'd like that. There's a small coffee shop on King Street." "I know the one." "Saturday morning?" "Saturday morning." As the call ended, Grant placed the phone gently on his desk. He didn't see it as a second chance. He saw it as a small opportunity. And after everything they had been through, he finally understood something he wished he had learned years ago. Strong relationships aren't rebuilt through grand gestures. They're rebuilt through ordinary moments handled with extraordinary care. Saturday would not determine the future of their marriage, but it would become the beginning of the hardest conversation either of them had ever chosen to have. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze drifting through downtown Charleston. King Street was already coming to life. Coffee shops filled with early customers. Couples strolled hand in hand past boutique storefronts. Musicians tuned their guitars outside nearby cafes, filling the air with soft melodies that blended with the hum of the city. Grant arrived 20 minutes early, not because he expected Autumn to be late, because he needed time to settle his own thoughts. He chose a small table on the outdoor patio where the morning sunlight filtered through large oak trees. A server approached. "Can I get you anything while you're waiting?" "A black coffee, please." As the cup was placed before him, Grant caught himself glancing toward the sidewalk every few seconds. Months ago, he would have rehearsed the perfect apology. Today, he rehearsed something different. Listening. At exactly 10 o'clock, Autumn turned the corner. She wore a simple light blue blouse, dark jeans, and comfortable sandals. Her hair fell naturally around her shoulders, moving gently with the breeze. Grant stood as she approached. "Good morning." "Good morning." She smiled politely before placing a worn leather sketchbook on the table. "I found this behind one of the storage boxes." Grant looked down at it and smiled. "I thought I'd lost it." "You almost did." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "Thank you for bringing it." "You're welcome." For a moment, neither of them knew whether to sit or say goodbye. Grant gestured toward the empty chair. "Would you have time for a cup of coffee?" Autumn hesitated. She checked the time on her watch. "I have about 30 minutes. "I'd like that." The conversation began carefully. Work, the weather, Danielle, Luke, the literacy program, Grant's architectural projects. Nothing too personal, nothing too painful. It felt almost like meeting someone new. In many ways, they were. After several minutes, the waitress returned. "What can I get for you?" "A vanilla latte, please," Autumn said. Grant smiled. "You still order the same thing?" She looked at him with quiet amusement. "You remembered." I remember more than you probably think. The coffee's arrived. Steam curled gently into the morning air. Autumn wrapped both hands around her mug. It feels strange. What does? Sitting here. Grant nodded. I know. But not in a bad way. Her honesty encouraged him. I'm glad. Another comfortable silence settled between them. Not empty. Peaceful. Finally Grant spoke. I've wanted to tell you something. Autumn looked up. He noticed the slight hesitation in her eyes. She wasn't afraid. She was protecting her heart. He respected that. I've been seeing a therapist. Autumn remained quiet. I started a few days after you left. She blinked, surprised. You have? He nodded. I should have gone years ago. There was no pride in his voice. No attempt to impress her. Only honesty. What made you decide to go? Grant looked down at his coffee. The house. The silence. He smiled sadly. And your journals. Autumn's expression changed. My journals? He nodded carefully. I found them. I wasn't looking for them. They were in the kitchen drawer. I read them. He immediately added, I'm sorry. I know they were private. I shouldn't have. Autumn studied him for several seconds. Instead of becoming angry, she asked quietly, What did you find? Grant took a slow breath. A woman who spent years loving a man who didn't know how to let himself be loved. Tears gathered in Autumn's eyes. I found grace. I found patience. I found hope. He swallowed hard. And I realized I spent years assuming I understood your heart. Without ever asking you to tell me about it. Autumn looked away. A single tear slipped down her cheek. She quickly brushed it away. I never wrote those journals hoping you'd read them. I know. I wrote them because I didn't know how else to carry everything I was feeling. Grant nodded. I understand that now. Autumn looked out toward the busy street. People laughed. Cars passed. Life continued around them. Finally, she asked the question that had quietly lived in her heart for months. When you said... She stopped herself. Grant already knew the words she couldn't bring herself to repeat. I can't stand you anymore. He closed his eyes briefly. I've replayed that moment every day. Did you mean it? His answer came without hesitation. No. What did you mean? Grant's voice became barely more than a whisper. I couldn't stand myself. Autumn looked at him. He continued. I hated the man I'd become. I hated how distant I was. How angry. How numb. I just didn't know how to say that. So instead, he looked directly into her eyes. I wounded the person who loved me most. The honesty in his voice left no room for excuses. No blame. No justification. Only accountability. Autumn felt something inside her soften. Not because the pain disappeared, but because, for the first time, he wasn't hiding behind his pride. I need you to know something too, Autumn said softly. Grant listened without interrupting. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I know. I left because I was disappearing. She took a slow breath. I started measuring my worth by whether I could make you smile. I believed if I just loved you a little harder, you'd eventually let me in. Her eyes filled again. When that stopped working, I started wondering whether I was the problem. Grant lowered his head. Every sentence revealed a hurt he had never noticed. I was never asking you to fix everything. She continued gently. I just wanted to know I wasn't carrying our marriage by myself. Grant's voice trembled. You were. I'm sorry. I know. She reached across the table, not to hold his hand, but simply to rest her fingertips near his. I believe you're changing, Grant. Hope flickered across his face. She smiled gently. But belief isn't the same as readiness. He nodded. I understand. I still need time. You have all the time you need. Those words mattered more than Grant realized. Months earlier, he would have begged her to come home. Now, he honored the pace of her healing. Autumn noticed. It was a small change, but meaningful ones often are. Their coffee had long since grown cold. Neither of them seemed to mind. As they stood to leave, Grant picked up his sketchbook. I drew buildings in this for years, he said with a faint smile. Autumn tilted her head. And now? He looked at her thoughtfully. Now I'm learning how to build something much harder. What's that? A healthier version of myself. Autumn smiled. I hope you do. I think you already are. Grant didn't answer immediately. Instead, he simply said, Thank you for meeting me. She nodded. Thank you for finally letting me hear your heart. They walked in opposite directions down King Street. Neither looked back immediately. Not because they didn't care, because they were no longer chasing the past. They were allowing the future to unfold one honest step at a time. And for the first time since the night, everything fell apart. Both of them left a conversation feeling lighter than when they had arrived. Summer slowly gave way to early autumn. Charleston's mornings became cooler, and the oak-lined streets were covered with leaves in shades of amber and gold. The city seemed to slow down, inviting people to linger over coffee, take longer walks, and appreciate the beauty hidden in ordinary moments. For Grant Sullivan, ordinary moments no longer felt ordinary. They had become opportunities. Every morning before leaving for work, he spent 15 quiet minutes on the back porch with a cup of coffee. Months ago, he would have been scrolling through emails before sunrise. Now his phone stayed inside. Instead, he listened. To birds waking in the trees. To the breeze rustling through autumn's flower garden, which he still carefully watered every weekend. To his own thoughts. For years he had filled every silence with work because silence reminded him of pain. Now he was learning that silence could also become a place where healing began. One Tuesday afternoon, Dr. Rebecca Morgan asked him a question that caught him completely off guard. When you think about reconciliation? Grant smiled faintly. I hope for it. I know. But why? He frowned. Because I love autumn. She nodded. What else? He thought for a moment. I miss her. What else? Another pause. Finally he sighed. I don't know. Dr. Morgan leaned forward. Let me ask it another way. If autumn never moved back into your house, would your healing still matter? Grant sat quietly for nearly a minute. Months earlier, his answer would have been no. Everything he had done had been driven by guilt and the desperate hope of repairing his marriage. But, somewhere along the journey, his reason for changing had quietly transformed. He smiled. Yes. What changed? I realized I wasn't becoming a better man to convince Autumn to love me again. He looked toward the window. I'm becoming a better man because that's the person I should have been all along. Dr. Morgan smiled warmly. Now your growth belongs to you. Grant nodded slowly. And, strangely, I feel lighter because of that. Across town, Autumn was discovering new parts of herself she had forgotten existed. She had joined a Saturday morning photography group that explored different parts of Charleston each weekend. She had never considered herself artistic. Grant had always been the creative one. But the first time she captured sunlight reflecting across the harbor, something inside her awakened. One morning, the group met near Rainbow Row. Their instructor, an older photographer named Samuel, paused beside Autumn as she adjusted her camera. What are you trying to capture? He asked. She smiled. The buildings. Samuel gently shook his head. Look again. Autumn frowned. I don't understand. Photography isn't about photographing what's obvious. It's about noticing what everyone else walks past. She looked through the viewfinder again. This time, she noticed an elderly couple sitting quietly on a bench, sharing a single cup of coffee. Neither of them was speaking. Yet the way they smiled at each other said more than words ever could. She pressed the shutter. Click. Samuel smiled. There it is. What? You stopped looking. And started seeing. The lesson stayed with Autumn long after the class ended. It reminded her of relationships. So often people focused on grand gestures while overlooking the quiet acts of love happening every day. Later that week, Danielle invited Autumn over for dinner. As they cleared the dishes, Danielle smiled knowingly. You've been humming all evening. I have? You have? Autumn laughed. I guess I've been in a good mood. Danielle leaned against the kitchen counter. Can I ask you something? You usually do. Have you thought about Grant? Autumn smiled softly. I never stopped thinking about him. I know, but something feels different. Autumn dried another plate before answering. I'm no longer thinking about who he used to be. I'm paying attention to who he's becoming. Danielle nodded. And? I like what I see. She quickly added, that doesn't mean everything is fixed. I know. It just means, she searched for the right words. I'm no longer afraid that change is impossible. Danielle smiled. That's a beautiful place to be. The following Friday, Grant received an unexpected email. It was from the architectural firm where he worked. The company had secured a massive commercial project in Atlanta. The promotion attached to it was exactly the opportunity he had spent years chasing. Higher salary, national recognition, a chance to lead one of the firm's biggest projects. There was only one condition. He would need to relocate for at least 18 months. 6 months earlier, Grant wouldn't have hesitated. Work had always come first. He stared at the email for several minutes before walking into his managing partner's office. "Grant," his boss said enthusiastically, "I assume you've seen the offer." "I have." "Congratulations. You've earned this." Grant smiled politely. "I appreciate that. When can we expect your answer?" Grant surprised even himself. "I'll need some time." His manager looked confused. "You've wanted an opportunity like this for years." "I know. So, what's changed?" Grant looked out the office window toward the Charleston skyline. "For the first time. I'm asking whether success is worth sacrificing the life I'm trying to rebuild." His manager smiled. "That's a different question than the Grant I hired 10 years ago would have asked." Grant nodded. "It is." As he left the office, he realized something profound. Personal growth isn't measured only by the choices we make. Sometimes it's measured by the questions we begin asking ourselves. Years ago, he asked, "Will this make my career stronger?" Now, he asked, "Will this make my life healthier?" The difference between those two questions had changed everything. That evening, Grant walked home instead of driving. The cool autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves. As he passed through the neighborhood park, he noticed a father helping his young daughter learn to ride a bicycle. She wobbled, fell, laughed, tried again. The father never became impatient. He simply encouraged her. "You've got this. I'm right here." Grant watched them for several moments before quietly continuing his walk. He smiled to himself. Real love wasn't about preventing someone from falling. It was about creating an environment where they felt safe enough to get back up. Months ago, he had unknowingly created the opposite. Now, he was determined never to make that mistake again. Grant couldn't stop thinking about the promotion. The email remained open on his laptop long after he arrived home that evening. Atlanta, a larger office, a higher salary, national recognition. Years ago, he would have accepted without reading past the first paragraph. Back then, success had a simple definition: achieve more, earn more, work harder. Now, the definition felt incomplete. He closed the laptop without replying. For the first time in his career, he wasn't asking, "What will advance my career?" He was asking, "What kind of life do I want to build?" That question stayed with him through the weekend. Monday morning, Grant sat across from Dr. Rebecca Morgan. "I received a promotion," he said. "Congratulations." "It doesn't feel like I expected." "What do you mean?" "I always thought getting this opportunity would make me happy." "And does it?" Grant smiled thoughtfully. "It makes me proud." "But not happy." Dr. Morgan nodded. "There's an important difference." She reached for a small notebook on the table. "Many people spend years chasing achievements, believing they'll eventually create peace." She looked up. "But peace isn't something success gives us. It's something we learn to protect." Grant reflected on those words. For years he had sacrificed birthdays, anniversaries, quiet evenings and vacations in pursuit of accomplishments that disappeared as soon as the next project arrived. There was always another deadline, another client, another promotion. He had spent so much time building his resume that he had forgotten to build his relationships. "I don't want to live like that anymore," he admitted. Dr. Morgan smiled. "Then don't." Sometimes the hardest changes begin with surprisingly simple decisions. That same week, Autumn's photography group announced a community exhibition. Each participant would display one photograph representing the theme, Hope in Ordinary Places. Autumn wasn't sure she wanted to participate. Samuel noticed her hesitation. "Why are you holding back?" "I don't think my work is good enough." Samuel smiled. "That's not what I asked." She laughed softly. "I guess I'm afraid." "Of what?" "Being judged." Samuel folded his arms. "You know what's interesting?" She looked at him curiously. "The people who care most usually doubt themselves the most." He pointed toward the harbor. "Go find your photograph. Don't look for perfection. Look for truth." Those words echoed in Autumn's mind for the rest of the afternoon. Later, while walking home, she noticed an elderly man patiently teaching his wife how to use the camera on her new phone. She laughed every time she pressed the wrong button. He laughed with her instead of at her. Neither of them seemed embarrassed, only grateful to be sharing the moment. Autumn quietly lifted her camera. Click. The photograph captured more than two people. It captured patience, kindness, partnership. She smiled. Hope wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes, hope looked like someone choosing patience when frustration would have been easier. A few days later, Danielle met Autumn for lunch. "You've been carrying that camera everywhere." Autumn laughed. "I guess I have." Danielle smiled. "I like this version of you." "So do I." There was a comfortable pause before Danielle asked, "Have you spoken to Grant since coffee?" A couple of times. Really? Autumn nodded. He called to ask how the literacy fundraiser went. And? That was all. Danielle looked surprised. He didn't try to convince you to come home? No. He didn't bring up the marriage? No. Danielle leaned back thoughtfully. That tells me more than anything he could have said. Autumn agreed. The old Grant always tried to solve problems immediately. And this Grant? This Grant seems willing to let healing happen naturally. She smiled. I respect that. Meanwhile, Grant made a decision. He walked into his manager's office, carrying the official promotion letter. I've made up my mind. His manager looked hopeful. So, Atlanta? Grant gently placed the envelope on the desk. I'm declining. The room fell silent. His manager blinked. I don't understand. A year ago, neither would I. Grant smiled. I've spent too much of my life chasing opportunities while ignoring the people I wanted to share them with. This position is incredible. It is. But the life I'm rebuilding matters more. His manager studied him carefully before extending his hand. I'm disappointed to lose you on this project. Grant shook his hand. But I'm proud of the reason you're saying no. As Grant walked back to his office, he didn't feel like he had given something up. He felt like he had finally chosen his priorities, instead of letting them choose him. That Saturday evening, Charleston hosted its annual Waterfront Lantern Festival. Hundreds of people gathered along the harbor as paper lanterns illuminated the shoreline. Families spread blankets across the grass. Musicians performed soft acoustic songs. Children chased one another beneath strings of glowing lights. Neither Grant nor Autumn knew the other planned to attend. Grant came because Luke insisted he needed to enjoy life again. Autumn came because Danielle refused to let her spend another Saturday alone. As fate would have it, they arrived from opposite ends of the park. Neither noticed the other immediately. Grant paused near the water, watching lanterns drift across the harbor. Autumn stopped several yards away, lifting her camera to capture the reflections dancing across the waves. She lowered the camera. Their eyes met. Neither seemed surprised this time. Instead, they smiled. A genuine, effortless smile. Grant walked over slowly. Hi. Hi. Beautiful evening. It really is. For a few moments, they stood side by side watching the lanterns float across the water. No awkwardness, no pressure, just quiet companionship. Autumn finally broke the silence. I entered one of my photographs into a community exhibition. Grant turned toward her. You did? She nodded. I almost didn't. What changed your mind? She smiled. I decided I didn't want fear making my decisions anymore. Grant nodded thoughtfully. I understand that. She looked at him. And you? He laughed softly. I turned down a promotion. Her eyebrows lifted. You did? I would have moved away. Autumn looked genuinely surprised. I thought that's what you always wanted. Grant watched another lantern drift into the distance. I used to think success meant climbing higher. He smiled gently. Now I think success is becoming someone the people I love can depend on. Autumn didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked at the reflection of the lanterns shimmering across the water. Months earlier, those words might have sounded like promises. Tonight, they sounded like truth. And there was a world of difference between the two. As another lantern floated quietly into the night sky, both of them realized something neither had expected. For the first time since their marriage began to fall apart, being together no longer felt painful. It felt peaceful. Neither of them knew where the path ahead would lead, but they had finally stopped walking against each other. Now, they were beginning to walk in the same direction. The Lantern Festival became a quiet turning point. Neither Grant nor Autumn talked about it afterward. There were no late-night phone calls, no emotional text messages, no sudden declarations that everything was going to be okay. Instead, life continued. Only now, it occasionally continued together. A week after the festival, Grant sent Autumn a simple text. Good luck with your photography exhibition this weekend. I know you'll do great. That was all. No question. No expectation of a reply. An hour later, his phone vibrated. Thank you. That means a lot. Grant smiled. It wasn't much. But healing is often measured in small moments that would have gone unnoticed before. Saturday afternoon arrived with bright blue skies over downtown Charleston. The Community Arts Center buzzed with visitors exploring paintings, sculptures, and photographs created by local artists. Autumn stood quietly near her display. Her photograph, an elderly couple laughing together while learning something new, hung beneath the title, Hope is Patient. Several visitors stopped to admire it. An older woman smiled warmly. This picture makes me miss my husband. Autumn returned the smile. What do you love most about it? The woman looked at the photograph for a long moment. It reminds me that love isn't always exciting. She chuckled softly. Sometimes it's simply choosing kindness over frustration. Autumn felt tears sting her eyes. That's exactly what I hoped people would see. The woman gently touched her arm before walking away. Moments later, another familiar voice spoke behind her. I think she understood it perfectly. Autumn turned. Grant stood there, holding a small bouquet of white daisies. Not roses, not expensive flowers, just simple daisies. Her favorite. He smiled awkwardly. I wasn't sure if bringing flowers would be too much. Autumn accepted them with a grateful smile. They're perfect. I remembered. I know. Neither of them mentioned that, during the final years of their marriage, he had forgotten almost every anniversary. Remembering the daisies meant more than any elaborate gift ever could. They slowly walked through the exhibition together. Grant stopped in front of Autumn's photograph again. I've looked at this picture 3 times already. She laughed. And? I think I finally understand why you chose it. What do you think it means? He studied the image carefully. It isn't really about photography. She smiled. No. It's about patience. It's about creating a place where someone feels safe enough to learn without being afraid of failing. Autumn looked at him with quiet admiration. Months ago, he would have admired the lighting, the composition, the camera. Today, he saw the heart behind the picture. You've changed, she whispered. Grant didn't deny it. I hope so. After leaving the exhibition, they walked toward the waterfront. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of salt water, as sailboats drifted across Charleston Harbor. For several minutes, they simply enjoyed the view. Finally, Autumn asked, Can I ask you something? Always. What made you remember the daisies? Grant smiled. You once told me they reminded you that beautiful things don't have to be complicated. He looked out across the water. I didn't understand that back then. And now? I do. Autumn laughed softly. You've become surprisingly thoughtful. Grant grinned. Therapy has a way of ruining your excuses. She laughed. A genuine laugh. The kind he hadn't heard in years. He realized he had missed that sound more than he had ever admitted. Later, they stopped at a small cafe overlooking the marina. This time, neither of them felt nervous. The conversation flowed naturally. They talked about books, photography, architecture, children from Autumn's literacy program, Luke's latest attempt to convince Grant to join a weekend hiking club, Danielle's dream of opening her own legal practice. Eventually, Autumn leaned back in her chair. You know what surprises me? What? We spent almost 2 hours together. Grant smiled. And? We haven't talked about fixing the marriage. He nodded. Because I don't think that's today's job. She looked curious. What do you think today's job is? He answered without hesitation. Learning how to enjoy each other's company again. Autumn's smile widened. I like that answer. As they left the cafe, dark clouds unexpectedly rolled across the sky. Within minutes, a summer shower swept through downtown Charleston. Oh no! Autumn laughed as the first raindrops fell. Grant looked around. Run! They hurried beneath the awning of a nearby bookstore, both laughing as rain poured onto the sidewalks. Autumn brushed rainwater from her hair. I haven't done that in years. What? Run through the rain. Grant smiled. I haven't either. For a moment, they stood shoulder to shoulder, watching people dash across the street, carrying shopping bags over their heads. Neither noticed they were smiling at each other, not because the rain was funny, because they had forgotten how easy happiness could feel. Grant glanced toward the bookstore window. Want to go inside until it passes? Autumn nodded. I'd love that. Inside, the warm scent of coffee and old books filled the air. Rows of novels stretched across polished wooden shelves. A cozy reading corner overlooked the rain-covered street. Autumn wandered toward the fiction section. Grant drifted into the architecture aisle. Several minutes later, he found her sitting in a comfortable chair, completely absorbed in a novel. She looked up and smiled. You found me. I had a feeling you'd be here. He held up a book. I found something for you. She accepted it. Its title read, The Art of Listening. Autumn laughed. Is this your way of apologizing? Grant rubbed the back of his neck sheepishly. Maybe. She smiled warmly. It's actually a good recommendation. She reached into the stack of books beside her. Then, I have one for you. He looked at the cover. The Gifts of Imperfection. Grant raised an eyebrow. I suppose I deserve that. She smiled. We all do. As they exchanged books, neither realized the symbolic weight of the moment. Months earlier, they had exchanged hurt. Now, they were exchanging growth. Neither book promised perfection, Both invited understanding. And perhaps that was exactly what their relationship had been missing all along. The rain outside the bookstore slowed to a gentle drizzle. Neither Grant nor Autumn seemed eager to leave. They wandered through the aisles at an unhurried pace, occasionally stopping to recommend books they had enjoyed or laugh over titles that reminded them of old memories. It was the easiest conversation they had shared in years, not because the past had disappeared, but because neither of them was trying to outrun it anymore. As they reached the checkout counter, Grant placed both books on the register. "I've got these." Autumn smiled. "You don't have to." "I know. I want to." She didn't argue. Months ago, she might have worried that accepting a small gesture would somehow send the wrong message. Now she understood something healthier. Accepting kindness didn't erase boundaries. It simply acknowledged sincerity. Outside, the sidewalks glistened beneath the fading rain. The air smelled fresh. Charleston seemed quieter after the storm. Grant glanced toward the harbor. "Would you like to walk for a little while?" Autumn looked at the clearing sky. "I'd like that." They followed the waterfront promenade, watching boats drift lazily across the water. For several minutes they simply enjoyed the peaceful rhythm of the afternoon. Eventually, Grant broke the silence. "Can I tell you something?" "Of course. I almost accepted a promotion in Atlanta." Autumn looked surprised. "You mentioned turning one down." "I didn't tell you how close I came." She waited. "I had convinced myself for years that every promotion was another step toward giving us a better life." He smiled sadly. "I never stopped to ask whether I was actually present enough to enjoy the life we already had." Autumn looked across the harbor before answering. "I used to think if I were more patient, or more understanding, or somehow easier to love, things would get better." She shook her head gently. "We were both chasing the wrong solutions." Grant nodded. "I was trying to provide everything except myself. And I was trying to carry everything by myself." They exchanged a quiet smile. Neither sentence was meant to assign blame. They were simply naming truths they hadn't been able to see before. Sometimes healing begins the moment two people stop arguing about who was right and become curious about what was real. As they continued walking, they reached a small wooden pier overlooking the marina. An elderly man sat at the edge with his grandson, patiently teaching the little boy how to fish. The child sighed dramatically. "I don't think the fish like me." The grandfather laughed. "They don't even know you yet." The little boy frowned. "So why won't they come?" "Because some good things take longer than we expect." Grant and Autumn couldn't help smiling. The grandfather glanced at them. "You two married?" The question caught both of them off guard. Grant looked toward Autumn before answering. "We are." The older man nodded. 48 years for my wife and me." He pointed toward the fishing line. "You know what marriage and fishing have in common?" Grant smiled. "I have no idea." "You can't spend the whole time pulling on the line." The old man chuckled. "Sometimes you've got to be patient. Sometimes you've got to be still. And sometimes you've got to trust that what you're waiting for is worth waiting on." Autumn thanked him with a warm smile. As they walked away, she laughed softly. "Charleston is full of philosophers." Grant grinned. "Or maybe we're finally paying attention." The weeks that followed unfolded gently. There were no dramatic declarations, no sudden reconciliation. Instead, Grant and Autumn began creating a new rhythm. They met for coffee every other Saturday. Occasionally, they attended community events together. Sometimes they simply exchanged a few text messages asking how the other's week had been. Each interaction ended with respect. Each conversation became a little easier. Trust wasn't returning all at once. It was returning in inches. One afternoon, Autumn received a message from Grant. "I'm making my mother's chicken soup tonight. I finally found her recipe. It reminded me how much you used to like it. I hope your day is going well." She smiled. There was no hidden agenda, no invitation, no guilt. Just kindness. She replied a few minutes later. "Thank you. I hope it turns out as good as hers always did." Grant laughed aloud when he read the message. It wasn't because of the soup. It was because their conversations no longer felt fragile. A month later, Danielle invited Autumn to dinner. Halfway through the meal, she asked the question she had been holding back for weeks. Autumn smiled knowingly. "So? Are you falling in love with Grant again?" Autumn rested her fork on her plate. "I never stopped loving him." Danielle nodded. "I know, but this feels different." "It is." "How?" Autumn thought carefully before answering. "The first time I loved him because of who I believed he was." She smiled softly. "This time, I'm learning to love the man he's choosing to become." Danielle's eyes warmed. And what about you? What about me? Do you think you've changed too? Autumn laughed. I hope so. In what way? I've stopped believing it's my job to rescue everyone. She looked down at her hands. I've learned that compassion without boundaries eventually becomes exhaustion. Danielle reached across the table and squeezed her hand. I'm proud of you. Autumn smiled. For the first time. I'm proud of me too. That evening, Grant sat on the back porch as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the trees. He opened the notebook he had been writing in for months. Instead of recording regrets, he wrote something new. Today, I realized that healing isn't about becoming the person I was before everything fell apart. It's about becoming someone wiser because it did. He closed the notebook and looked toward the empty rocking chair beside him. For the first time, he no longer saw it as a symbol of loss. He saw it as a place of hope. Not because he expected Autumn to return tomorrow, but because he had finally become the kind of man who would welcome her with honesty instead of emotional walls. Miles away, Autumn stood on the balcony of her apartment, watching the same sunset paint the Charleston sky in shades of orange and gold. Without knowing it, both of them whispered the very same prayer. Thank you for not giving up on me while I was learning how to grow. The distance between them was no longer measured in miles. It was measured in healing. And with each passing day, that distance grew a little smaller. Nearly a year had passed since the night Grant looked at his wife and uttered the 5 words he would spend months wishing he could take back. Charleston had completed another cycle of seasons. The magnolia blossoms of spring had given way to the warmth of summer. Summer had softened into autumn. Autumn had quietly surrendered to winter. And now, the first hints of spring were returning once again. Grant often thought about how nature never rushed its seasons. No tree apologized for taking time to bloom. No flower compared its journey to another's. Healing, he had learned, followed much the same rhythm. It couldn't be forced, only nurtured. Saturday mornings had become something Grant genuinely looked forward to. Not because they were extraordinary, because they were ordinary. And he had finally learned that ordinary moments were where relationships were truly built. This Saturday he stood in his kitchen preparing blueberry pancakes. The recipe was one Autumn had taught him years ago. Back then, he had laughed every time she insisted that a little vanilla extract made all the difference. He hadn't believed her. Now, as the familiar aroma filled the kitchen, he smiled to himself. She had been right. About the pancakes, about many things. His phone buzzed. A text message appeared. Autumn, running about 10 minutes late. I hope you didn't burn breakfast. Grant laughed aloud. He typed back. Grant, no promises. A moment later, 3 laughing emojis appeared on his screen. It was such a small exchange. Yet, if someone had told him a year earlier that one day he and Autumn would joke with each other again, he wouldn't have believed it. A soft knock sounded at the front door. Grant opened it. Autumn stood on the porch carrying a small basket of fresh strawberries from the farmer's market. I brought backup. He smiled. In case I ruined breakfast. She laughed. Exactly. For a brief moment, they simply looked at one another. The nervousness that had once accompanied every meeting had faded. In its place was something quieter. Comfort. Not the comfort of taking each other for granted. The comfort of knowing neither had to pretend anymore. Come in, Grant said. She stepped inside. The house looked different. Not because of new furniture, because of the atmosphere. The television wasn't blaring in the background. Grant's laptop wasn't open on the dining table. Fresh flowers rested in a vase near the kitchen window. Soft jazz played from a speaker on the counter. The house no longer felt like a place people passed through. It felt lived in. Autumn noticed immediately. You've changed the living room. Grant nodded. I wanted it to feel less like a waiting room. She smiled. It does. They worked side by side in the kitchen. Autumn sliced strawberries, while Grant flipped pancakes. Occasionally their hands reached for the same utensil. They laughed, stepped aside, made room for one another. It was such a simple morning. Yet it reminded them of who they had once been. The difference was, this time they appreciated it. As they carried breakfast to the dining table, Grant paused. I've been thinking about something. Autumn looked up. What's that? Our house. She waited. I've realized it stopped feeling like a home long before you left. Autumn quietly nodded. I know. I kept thinking a bigger television. A nicer dining table. Or another renovation would somehow make us happier. He smiled sadly. I spent years improving the house. He looked into her eyes. I forgot to improve the marriage inside it. Autumn reached for her coffee. My grandmother used to say something. Grant smiled. I always liked your grandmother's advice. She believed every home rests on 4 pillars. What are they? She counted them on her fingers. Respect, trust, communication, and kindness. She smiled gently. If one pillar weakens, the whole house eventually begins to lean. Grant reflected on her words. As an architect, he immediately understood the comparison. No building could remain strong if its foundation was ignored. Relationships weren't any different. I spent years checking the walls, he admitted. I never inspected the foundation. After breakfast, they carried their coffee onto the back porch. Grant looked toward the second rocking chair. Months ago, it had represented emptiness. Today, Autumn sat in it. Neither of them mentioned the symbolism. Some moments didn't need explaining. They simply needed to be lived. The morning breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine through the backyard. Birds chirped from the nearby oak trees. For several peaceful minutes, neither of them spoke. Grant finally broke the silence. You know, I used to be afraid of quiet. Autumn smiled knowingly. I remember. I thought silence meant something was wrong. And now? He looked around. Now I think silence can also mean two people finally feel safe enough not to fill every moment with words. Autumn nodded. There's a difference between uncomfortable silence and peaceful silence. Grant smiled. We finally found the second one. Later that afternoon, they decided to clean the garage. Boxes that had been untouched for years lined the shelves. Old holiday decorations, camping equipment, photo albums, several unopened moving boxes from their first home together. Autumn laughed as she opened one. I forgot we even owned half this stuff. Grant held up a waffle maker still in its original packaging. We bought this on sale. She burst into laughter. And never used it. I guess we were waiting for the perfect weekend. Autumn smiled thoughtfully. Life has a funny way of teaching us that perfect weekends don't exist. Grant looked at the unopened box in his hands. No, they don't. But ordinary Saturdays. He glanced toward her. Turn out to be pretty wonderful. Autumn smiled. They do. As they continued sorting through the boxes, Grant reached toward one tucked behind several storage bins. Dust covered its lid. He frowned. I don't remember this one. Neither did Autumn. He carefully lifted it onto the workbench. Inside were old keepsakes, movie ticket stubs, birthday cards, photographs, and beneath them, a familiar hardcover journal wrapped with a faded blue ribbon. Grant froze. Autumn's smile slowly faded. She stared at the journal. I thought I'd packed all of them. Grant carefully picked it up. Unlike the others, this one had never been opened. On the front cover, written in Autumn's familiar handwriting, were 4 simple words. For someday. Maybe. Neither of them spoke. Somewhere deep inside, both realized this wasn't just another journal. It was something neither of them had expected to find. And neither of them was prepared for what waited inside its pages. Grant held the journal as though it were made of glass. The faded blue ribbon was tied in the same careful knot Autumn always used. But unlike the others he had discovered months earlier, this one looked untouched. He glanced at her. Do you want to open it? Autumn's eyes remained fixed on the cover. I honestly don't know. For several seconds, neither of them moved. It was strange how something so small could carry the weight of an entire year. Finally, Autumn took a slow breath. I think we should read it together. Grant nodded. If at any point you want to stop. I will. She offered him a small smile. And, if there's something in there that's difficult to hear, we'll face it together. Those 4 words settled gently between them. Not as a promise that life would never be difficult again, but as a promise that they would no longer face difficulty alone. They carried the journal onto the back porch. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard as they settled into the 2 rocking chairs that had become symbols of both heartbreak and healing. Autumn carefully untied the ribbon. She opened the first page. Inside, in her familiar handwriting, was a short note. If you're reading this with me, then life was kinder than I expected. Autumn stopped. Her eyes immediately filled with tears. Grant swallowed hard. She continued reading. I started this journal on the night I realized our marriage was changing. Not because I wanted to remember the pain, but because I was afraid I would someday forget how much I still loved my husband. Grant lowered his head. Autumn turned another page. Unlike her previous journals, this one wasn't a daily record. It was a collection of letters. Letters she had never intended to send. The first one began simply, Dear Grant, if you're reading this, I hope you found the peace that always seemed just beyond your reach. I spent years wishing I could carry your pain for you. But eventually I learned that healing is something each person must choose for themselves. I couldn't make that choice for you, no matter how deeply I loved you. Grant closed his eyes. Every sentence felt like both a wound and a gift. Autumn continued, I want you to know something I've never said out loud. I never wanted a perfect husband. I never needed expensive vacations, promotions, or a bigger house. My favorite moments were always the ordinary ones. Saturday pancakes, evening walks, laughing over burned dinners, and sitting quietly beside you while the world slowed down. Grant couldn't hold back his tears. Those were the very moments he had once considered too ordinary to protect. Now he understood they had been extraordinary all along. Autumn turned another page. Halfway down, her own handwriting caused her voice to tremble. If one day we find our way back to each other, I hope it isn't because we're afraid of being alone. I hope it's because we've both become brave enough to be honest. She paused to wipe away a tear. Grant reached into his pocket and quietly handed her a handkerchief. She smiled gratefully before continuing. Real love isn't about finding someone who never hurts you. It's about finding someone willing to take responsibility when they do, and someone willing to forgive without losing themselves. The porch grew quiet. The breeze rustled the leaves overhead. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Sometimes, silence was the only response truth required. Grant finally broke the silence. I spent so many years believing I was protecting you from my pain. Autumn looked at him. You were protecting yourself from it. He nodded. I know that now. He looked toward the backyard. I thought if I kept everything inside, I was being strong. Autumn smiled gently. My grandmother used to say something. Grant laughed softly. I've missed hearing her wisdom. She smiled. She always said that walls keep pain out, but they also keep love out. Grant sat quietly. That's exactly what I built. He looked at Autumn with complete honesty. I built walls so high that eventually I couldn't even hear the person calling my name from the other side. Autumn reached across the small table between them and rested her hand over his. This time, neither of them pulled away. A few pages later, something slipped from the journal and drifted onto the porch floor. Grant bent down to pick it up. It was an old photograph. Their first apartment. The tiny kitchen with the broken cabinet door. The two of them stood in the middle of the room covered in paint after attempting to renovate it themselves. Grant laughed through his tears. I completely forgot about this. Autumn smiled. You painted the ceiling before we covered the furniture. And ruined your favorite chair. You spent 2 weeks trying to clean it. They both laughed. The memory no longer carried sadness. It carried gratitude. Healing hadn't erased the past. It had given them permission to remember it, without becoming trapped inside it. Near the back of the journal they found the final, unfinished page. Autumn's breathing caught. Only one sentence had been written. I hope one day he'll truly see me. Nothing followed. The page ended there. Grant stared at those words for a long time. Without speaking, he stood, walked inside the house, and returned with a pen. He looked at Autumn. May I? She nodded. With slow, careful handwriting, Grant wrote beneath her unfinished sentence. And I hope you know that I finally do. Not because you changed who you were, but because I finally learned how to see with an open heart. Thank you for loving me long enough to tell me the truth. And thank you for loving yourself enough to walk away until I learned it. He set the pen down. Autumn read his words once, then again. Tears rolled quietly down her cheeks. Not tears of heartbreak, not even tears of relief. They were tears of recognition. For the first time in years, she felt completely seen. She closed the journal and looked at Grant. You know, he waited. When I left, I honestly believed that chapter of our lives was over. Grant nodded. So did I. She smiled through her tears. But now I realize something. What's that? We didn't get our old marriage back. Grant gently squeezed her hand. No. She looked around the home they had rebuilt together, not just with fresh paint and repaired rooms, but with honesty, accountability, patience, and grace. We built a better one. Grant's eyes glistened. I wouldn't trade this version of us for the one we used to be. Neither would I. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the Charleston skyline, they sat together on the back porch in comfortable silence. There were no dramatic speeches, no perfect ending. Only two imperfect people who had learned that love is not sustained by grand promises, but by daily choices. The choice to listen before speaking. The choice to apologize without excuses. The choice to remain curious about the person you love. The choice to seek help when wounds become too heavy to carry alone. And the choice to keep growing, even after making painful mistakes. The journal rested on the small table between them, a reminder of everything they had survived and everything they had learned. What Autumn had left behind was never just a collection of handwritten pages. She had left behind a path that taught Grant how to heal, taught Autumn how to honor her own worth, and reminded them both that the strongest relationships are not built by perfect people. They are built by two imperfect hearts, willing to choose each other again, one honest day at a time. And as the porch lights came on and evening settled gently around their home, Grant looked at Autumn with a quiet smile. "Ready for those waffles we never made?" She laughed, the sound warm and free. "I thought you'd never ask." Together, they walked back inside, not toward a perfect future, but toward one they would continue building side by side, with love that had finally learned how to listen. As Grant and Autumn's journey comes to an end, we're reminded that the strongest relationships aren't the ones that never face hardship. They're the ones where both people are willing to grow, take responsibility, and choose each other again, one day at a time. Now we'd love to hear from you. What was the biggest lesson you learned from Grant and Autumn's story? Was there a moment that touched your heart or reminded you of your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your words may encourage someone who needs hope today. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another unforgettable love story filled with hope, healing, second chances, and meaningful life lessons. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, don't keep it to yourself. Share this story with them. Sometimes, one story, one conversation, or one lesson can change a life. Until next time, remember this. Love isn't about finding the perfect person. It's about becoming the kind of person who knows how to love with honesty, grace, patience, and courage. Thank you for being part of the Love Stories by Mr. Johnson family. We'll see you in the next story.